One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
Killings similar to John F. Kennedy USA soil. There are cases in America where the opponents of the Vietnam War have been killed in front of this war, regardless of the means. Martin Luther King Jr. and John F. Kennedy, who both opposed this war, tells what American democracy is, namely the new clothes of the dictatorship of those in power, through which it is difficult to see.
At this time, I have the honor to present to you the moral leader of our nation.
One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr., who became known as a defender of black rights, defending them and exposing injustices in America. Dr. King, who has remained in the history books of mankind as a defender of rights and how mankind knows him. Dr. King, whose real work has remained hidden from humanity and which was revealed during his work as a defender of human rights, namely the true face of the democratic governance model and the actual importance of state agencies, where the Finnish state plays the main part with its own actions when it acts in the name of democracy, even murdering unwanted parliamentary candidates of the party of the White King Sauli Niinisto of the coalition, as well as Finnish police remand prisoners either in the light of financial cover-ups or eye for an eye, tooth for tooth reprisals, where the triggering signal of course comes from the corporate world, which is full of Hults Niko Koseli and Mika Kiljala and Cone Elevators Antti-Paapa Herlin, who owns the Finnish courts thanks to his Cone Elevator money, where self-reported fake kidnappings of sister-in-law girls are carried out like summer theatre. Dr. King, who was allowed to live all these years very peacefully when he stood for human rights, but who was assassinated very quickly when he sided with the opponents of the Vietnam War, just like John F. Kennedy.
From 1955 to 1968, Martin Luther King led a peaceful 20th century American Revolution. In the short span of 13 years, the non-violent civil rights movement which he headed changed the face of American society.
You know, when you construct a man as a great man, there's nothing almost more satisfying than also seeing him represented as the opposite.
When the National Archives puts government documents up on the web, in public, one has to confront them. One cannot pretend they don't exist.
I think one of the difficulties for historians in dealing with really the fruits of all of this surveillance of King is whether or not we then become complicit in what the FBI was doing.
But you know this about humans. What we're best at is convincing ourselves of our own righteousness. I think this entire episode represents the darkest part of the Bureau's history.
Tapes from the hotel rooms, the FBI reports of what was going on, those are pieces of information that we shouldn't have. Whatever comes out will certainly help us understand him as a person And that's kind of our duty, is to understand. The FBI was most alarmed about King because of his success. And they were particularly concerned that he was this powerful, charismatic figure who had the ability to mobilize people.
And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. So let freedom ring.
When you look at the social movements from the point of view of the FBI, it looks very different. You know, J. Edgar Hoover is famous for saying that he feared the rise of a black messiah.
Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
After Dr. King gave his famous March on Washington speech, Wednesday, August 28, 1963, in a memo dated the 30th of August, no later than that, the second person in the FBI, it may have been Sullivan, sends an urgent memo in which he says, after the March on Washington, it's clear that Martin Luther King Jr. is the most dangerous Negro in America. And we have to use every resource at our disposal to destroy him.
FBI operations. The FBI's actions regarding Dr. King were, to say the least, dictatorial communism, which revealed the true face of democracy and the real purpose of government agencies. The FBI, whose mission was to uncover matters related to Dr. King's private life that could have humiliated him and undermined his authority. Such an action leaves a big question mark over all political ideologies, whether they are all just different clothes of a dictatorship with the help of which those in power try to secure their own position at the head of the state. At the time of Dr. King, America was promoted as a democracy of which Dr. King was the true embodiment, but in which state institutions such as the FBI used at least communist techniques to destroy Dr. King, who was demanding rights for the black population, in the name of democracy, of course. Based on the documentary, one could ask what the FBI has to fear in a black man who is demanding rights for his peers, if it were not a state institution whose mission is to protect the state dictatorship and its nominal leaders who act in the name of democracy, because this is what the FBI's actions with Dr. King point to, and which I also discuss in connection with the assassination of John F. Kennedy. J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, who watched the NGOs and who feared the rise of a black messiah in the democratic USA, is a clear sign that democracy is just the new clothes of dictatorship and communism for the eyes of the people, because with these NGOs, as a large mass together with a leader, they could compete for power and power position in a democratic society, and this has been the only reason for the existence of the FBI in America. To follow possible persons and organizations seeking power in America. This is also supported by the fact that FBI Deputy Director W.C. Sullivan wrote about Dr. King as like the leader of a criminal organization or drug trade, that he is the most dangerous black man in America. Such statements are only made about hardened criminals, and Dr. King was not one. So all that remains is the threat of stealing a dictatorship in a nominally democratic state, to which Dr. King was a possible threat because a large number of people liked him and he appealed to people for his good intentions, and that would have become a big problem on the political side, if this group had wanted to pursue power. The two faces of the FBI.
I think there have always been a couple of really important tensions within the FBI. One is being a very rule-bound organization, a very professional organization, an organization very attuned to jurisdiction and law, and then being an organization that was almost lawless.
Hotel type of situation, the FBI and its buddies on the hotel staff could decide in advance what room is Martin Luther King going to be assigned to and have the microphones in place.
they would set up the bugs in his hotel rooms and usually would take the room either next door or downstairs somewhere where they could, in fact, listen to the recordings, monitor what was going on, and sometimes, observe physically who was going in and out of the room. Because when you have a recording, all you have are a bunch of voices. One of the challenges of those recordings is trying to figure out, particularly in sexual situations with more than a couple of people involved, who's saying what, who's doing what. And so there was physical surveillance then involved to know who was in the room, who appeared to sound what way, and what they might be up to. This was a way that you could bring down a very successful, influential Black civil rights leader and contain the movement by destroying its figurehead. And so it's at that moment that the FBI decide that they're really going to operationalize and go quite overtly after King.
When you stand up against the forces of evil, you will be persecuted for righteousness' sake. In the words of the spiritual, you will be buked and scorned. You will be talked about, you will be lied on, you will be persecuted in many ways. You will be thrown again, maybe into narrowed and frustrating jail cells. I can't promise you that you can avoid this.
The Bureau has all of these hotel room recordings. And so Sullivan has his underlings compose a greatest hits compendium tape, and then sits down at his own typewriter to draft an anonymous threatening letter to King.
This is purportedly from an admirer within the movement who has found out about King's sexual indiscretions, feels betrayed by it, and writes this full-page, really scurrilous letter denouncing King as a beast and a pervert and a monster, a hypocrite, and in fact saying, "I know what you've done."
It's clearly a very poor quality attempt of someone who's sort of culturally clueless to pass as Black.
They put this package together and send it off, saying, "King, you know what you have to do," and giving him a deadline by which he needs to do it. Many people have interpreted that to be that you need to kill yourself, and this is one of the ways that King and his confidants who saw this letter interpreted it. There's some ambiguity there, but it is one of the most notorious dirty tricks that the FBI ever conducted in the 1960s.
Have you read that letter?
Yes, I have. Sick to my stomach, actually. I mean, I didn't throw up, but I felt ill reading it. And that's what I mean when I say I think this entire episode represents the darkest part of the Bureau's history.
The package was sent to the office. I think it was mailed to us from somewhere in Florida. We never saw it. It was put in a box and sent to Coretta. So she opened it up and she played it. And then she called the office and said, "Look, somebody has sent a tape in here trying to get Martin to kill himself. And they have a recording of some man and woman in the bed." I didn't even want to hear it, you know. This was designed to upset him. We always assumed that Hoover was behind it. My philosophy about the movement is that unless I saw something with my own eyes, you really have to be careful what you believe.
The FBI, whose entire operation was based on protecting the power of those in power, which, as a government agency, gathered information about non-governmental organizations and tried to destroy them by destroying their leaders like Dr. King and by infiltrating inside them, causing disputes and controversies. I can't help but notice that the FBI's modus operandi is very close to authoritarian states. The only thing that could support FBI's legal actions is that it tries to prevent the rise to power of another person like Adolf Hitler, but at this point it can be said that it itself has been involved in the rise to power of these war fanatics who had a strong desire to go to Vietnam to fight. How the FBI itself protected itself from accusations.
One of the things that's helped to legitimize the FBI is American popular culture.
The FBI.
I think that we're constantly battling with popular representations of police, FBI, and federal agents
20, go ahead.
as our saviors.
The FBI was incredibly good under Hoover at promoting an image of itself really as the heroes of America.
Gee, Mr. Hoover, your G-men sure are good. I'd like to be one when I grow up.
But if you work hard, play hard, live clean, you certainly will be one.
One of the most important things that Hoover did was to create a bureau really in his own image. That meant that he hired a very particular kind of person as an agent. A relatively conservative white man of a certain height and a certain weight. He particularly liked fraternity boys and football players. But there's a reason that people know when you say, that's a G-man. There's something that you have in mind. It's a man in a suit, a white man, probably about 6 feet tall, buff, conservative. That was what Hoover wanted.
The FBI, which protected its own background from accusations, resorted to the recruitment of reputable sports-type persons, and it created a public image of the G-man, whose image was inflated in the media, which makes it easy to repel all future accusations of murdering future men of peace. This activity, i.e. the cancellation of accusations of one's own actions, is nowadays the cornerstone of the entire democracy and the basis of its dictatorial activities, where all accusations are cancelled by the complete facade of state agencies, purposeful action and, above all, by blaming the victims of their own illegal activity for everything, and which has become more of the rule in medical psychiatry than it is drags unprofitable problem citizens to the state as medical human rats to fuel. The academic careers of Turku University Jarmo Hayatala and Walter Major Helena and what has become of the coalition's murder policy and brick-and-mortar business, at least in Finland, which is supported by the money of the rich Cone Elevator family. Finland, where the citizen, in other words, can't do anything when the Finnish authorities, with the help of extensive cooperation, attack problem citizens who are unprofitable to the state from all directions, where they have no other option than to attack society. But this has actually become the last nail in the coffin of these human rats and the justification for the Finnish authorities to condemn them as mentally ill to the human rat farms owned and managed by the University of Turku, which are used as fuel for Walter Major Helena's academic career. These human rats, who are accused of mental illness like witches in the Middle Ages, cannot defend themselves against this illegal human trafficking, which the states currently conduct with their own unprofitable citizens in the medical field, and whose imaginary diseases it uses individuals to believe in, and knowing their future bystander human victims. The authorities do not hesitate at all to target illegal actions against these problem citizens which, measured by weight, are worth more than gold to the human rat business of medicine. Cone elevators involved in the illegal activities of the business world. The corporate world and its absolute kingpin, Cone elevators media mogul Antti-Paapa Herlin, who is clearly involved in this murderous policy of the coalition practiced by the Finnish authorities, which is the sick cleansing operation of Europe's new plague, Saaliiniinisto, which he is carrying out in Finland, not on a racial basis, but around citizens who are unprofitable to the state. cone elevator money which are used to support the medically non-existent and imaginary diseases of the University of Turku, in the name of which researchers from the University of Turku such as Jarmo Hayatala and Walter Major Helena can build their own academic careers, and with which Finland as a state can employ highly educated university researchers with the help of this human rat business. The rich brats of cone elevators, who are not familiar to me only from the company built by their father, but from the fake kidnapping of Minna Nurminen, which this rich family orchestrated in Finland, whose courts and in fact the entire authority field is under the orders of Antti-Paapa Hurlin, and the Finnish authorities has nothing to do with this fake kidnapping but to sing the songs of this rich family, which can mean murders in some times. Fake kidnapping of Minna Nurminen, which the Finnish police themselves blessed with their own alibi with criminal investigations that were outsourced all the way to United Brotherhood's Keijo Vilhunen. The reason why nobody but me talks about the operation of these cone elevators in Finland is obvious, because this rich family can destroy companies by pushing their work to other companies, or just for fun, they can build a competing business to steal other people's jobs. The business field managed by Paapa Hurlin is capable of handing out death sentences where the arms manufacturer Patria, owned by the White King of the Coalition, is used when the death sentences handed out behind the fakes are put into practice by sending them, if necessary, even to Uganda, where the former Coalition Minister Suvi Linden online shops for ordered murders from her own diplomatic shelters, which is an activity secured by the African trade managed by Jutta Urpilainen. The value, by the way, is 235 billion euros, in front of which any African state promises to murder the parliamentarians on the blacklist of the White King of the Coalition, Sauli Niinisto. Olli Isotalo, who was the CEO of Patria at the time of the Trasvuori murder, is currently the CEO of the family business Mantsinen, which means that we have many people in leading positions in the Finnish corporate world who are capable and ready to murder Finnish citizens if the interests of the Finnish state require it, and which has formed the murderous policy and the bread and butter business for Finnish medical care and the Finnish police, which is all buried under the shiny advertising slogans of their beautiful fakes about helping people, but whose actions are very similar to North Korea's Kim Jong-un, i.e. to lure citizens behind the barn and let them out of their suffering, which has also become the bread and butter of the President of Finland, a little bit Veikko Sauli Niinisto. But this is not the only illegal thing that state authorities do in the name of the credibility of their own institutions, such as stealing money intended for poor people, for which there are always excuses to making the lives of poor people more difficult, and by distributing the money to medicine, which uses these unprofitable citizens as human rats and guinea pigs for their own illegal activities, by developing medicines for the seasonal flu, the effectiveness of which is almost non-existent and disposable every year because of a different flu. I will only briefly talk about these illegal activities in connection with this article because there will be a separate article for these topics later. Universities act as spreaders of state lies. Climate change, for example, is turning out to be a big lie, just like the coronavirus, in the name of which state decision makers can take incredibly large amounts of money from the state coffers to their own tax haven companies, from where money can be distributed wherever it is wanted in the name of climate change. Climate change, whose operation is like a medieval begging, where a citizen got a place in heaven when he gave money to the church. Climate change, which has been blessed by university-level researchers and professors who, at least in Finland, engage in the most illegal activities with problem citizens with medically non-existent and imaginary diseases, and which are a guarantee for their salary and academic career. So in this area, apparently, we will not see an unbiased opinion on the patient's health, which is subjected to the human rat of medicine. This operation is like Nazi Auschwitz revived with new horrors. These researchers of the Faculty of Psychiatry, in other words, by and by their own academic careers at the expense of the health and freedom of these problem citizens staged with medically non-existent and imaginary diseases that they are researching even though it is a fraud of their own medicine. Among these false statements of academic and university-level professors in Finland, we can take, for example, the statements of Dan Frandi of the University of Helsinki and Terttu Utriainen of the University of Lapland about Anneli Aura's baseless sexual crimes against her own children for which she was convicted when she killed her own husband. Such a lie shows that these university-level professors are always in Finland 100% under the command of Sauli Niinisto, the White King of the coalition, even if they have to lie. And why do we have climate change on Earth, which allows state decision-makers to get access to state money and can distribute it however they want when it comes to the church fake climate change like aid trade? And as a point on top of the Chancellor of Justice of Finland Tuomas Poisti has cancelled the criminal complaint filed by me for the murder of Jimmy Kartunen, more than 2 years old, which is indeed Tuomas Poisti getting caught with his pants down. How the laws work in Finland and how they actually protect the authorities when the people think that the authorities follow their own laws, but which are overturned, at least in Finland, very quickly in the proceedings of Tuomas Poisti when the investigation is on Finnish citizens murdered by the authorities. Civil rights, Nobel and FBI.
Down this avenue of sadness they bring President John F. Kennedy, martyred hero, to lie in state under the great dome of the Capitol.
No memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long.
Congress passes the most sweeping civil rights bill ever to be written into the law, and thus reaffirms the conception of equality for all men that began with Lincoln and the Civil War 100 years ago. The Negro won his freedom then, he wins his dignity now. 5 hours after the House passes the measure, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is signed at the White House by President Johnson. Before an audience of legislators and civil rights leaders who had labored long and hard for passage of the bill, President Johnson calls for all Americans to back what he calls a turning point in history. Integration leader Martin Luther King receives his pen, a gift he said he would cherish. The Department of Justice will enforce the law if necessary, and G-Man Chief J. Edgar Hoover is present. Now, in this summer of 1964, the Civil Rights Bill is the law of the land. In the words of the President, it restricts no one's freedom so long as he respects the rights of others.
This is an extremely moving moment in my life.
We didn't know anything about it. We didn't even know that Dr. King had been nominated until it was announced that he had received the Nobel Prize.
I do not consider this merely an honor to me personally, but a tribute to the discipline, wise restraint, and majestic courage of the millions of gallant Negroes and white persons of goodwill who have followed a nonviolent course in seeking to establish a reign of justice and a rule of love across this nation of ours. One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
Human rights, which had been a sensitive subject for the American states and caused a lot of opposition after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. On the 7th of February, 1964, Lyndon Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act, and in my eyes there are two reasons for this: to ignore and divert attention from the assassination of John F. Kennedy planned by the elite of the United States, which all the reasons go to the necks of Lee Harvey Oswald when he is assassinated almost immediately after the murder of John F. Kennedy, that he does not go to talk about his plans to the press and how Lyndon hoped that with this bill he could buy the people's approval for the Vietnam War and why John F. Kennedy was assassinated in the first place. MLK Jr. received the Nobel Peace Prize for his achievements, which Lyndon Johnson accepted with his signature, caused much frustration in J. Edgar Hoover, who did not agree that MLK Jr. could be a moral leader of blacks and a representative of peace because of his secret private life that completely contradicted the general assumption, and in Hoover's opinion, too. J. Edgar Hoover liar accusations.
Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.
I call upon you. I have the great honor, on behalf of the Nobel Committee, to hand over to you the insignia of the Nobel Peace Prize, the diploma, and the gold medal. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Now, this is the greatest honor that King has received. And the fact that King is now being internationally celebrated as a moral leader deeply angers and offends both Hoover and Sullivan.
He was upset that this young black man, who I think at that time was 34, 35, is being recognized around the world as a pioneer in peace and justice. Hoover was being ignored, and he blamed us.
Now, what am I going to do about Martin Luther King with all these reports that are coming in on him all the time? And then can't somebody tell him, watch his conduct?
Lord, looks to me like he's too far gone. A lot of it, as far as his relationship with girls is concerned, it doesn't seem anything about one of that.
Well,
maybe they're getting the Nobel Prize. We need to be more careful about it. Of course, Hoover loves that because he doesn't like King.
Now, they're pressing me to attend a dinner in his honor in New York. I can't do that, can I?
I would think you could, but I wouldn't advise you to. I'd find some other reason why you can't.
The FBI is frustrated that even though they've successfully caught King in 15 or more hotel rooms, and they've distributed this behind the scenes to church leaders, to reporters, nothing's publicly happened. That despite all of the hundreds and hundreds of man-hours that they've put into this, King has not been personally destroyed.
For Hoover, a lot of this is framed as a matter of hypocrisy. Here's this sainted minister presenting himself as this great moral authority, but we actually know he's this sick, dirty, perverted creature. And you see that kind of language all over FBI documents.
The FBI surveillance of Dr. King, it was special in the fact that whatever city he went to, it was all hands on deck. Everything else stopped. Hoover was obsessed with Martin Luther King and his activities. From what I heard, there were some photographs, whoever was in them, that just kind of fed that mindset of Hoover, that this was a dangerous man and needed to be removed.
Now, this is not the way that Sullivan or Hoover themselves would have said it, but there was a radicalism to King's sexuality that they viewed as offensive.
For Hoover in particular, he himself tried to be a very tightly controlled person when it came to matters of his personal life and his sexuality and the way that he policed the boundaries of that. Now, that's a complicated story in its own right.
Hoover, and particularly Bill Sullivan, the head of domestic intelligence, paternalistically thought that Martin Luther King Jr. was morally unfit to be a leader of Black America.
And they came and they told us that Hoover had made this speech to a women's organization, that Martin Luther King was the world's most notorious liar. Say, well, I don't know what he was lying about.
Well, naturally, I was shocked and greatly surprised that Mr. Hoover would make such an unwarranted and vicious accusation. I don't think Mr. Hoover would have made such a statement if he had not been under a great deal of pressure.
Do you believe the FBI is doing all it can to resolve civil rights complaints?
Well, I don't know all of the inner workings of the FBI. I do know that in cases that do not involve Negroes and civil rights, the FBI moves with dispatch. It has the machinery, the know-how. Fact remains that in spite of all of the brutalities that we faced in Albany, Georgia, not a single arrest was made. In spite of the fact that 4 unoffending, innocent Negro girls were brutally murdered in a church in Birmingham, Alabama, not a single arrest has been made. And in spite of the fact that the civil rights workers were killed this summer in Mississippi, we haven't seen a single arrest.
After Hoover denounced Martin Luther King as the most notorious liar in the United States, it produced a real showdown between Hoover and King.
I have no comment to make on that.
How are you feeling, Mr. Hoover?
Excellent.
Is there any response on your part to the suggestions that you resign?
That's the wish, father to the thought.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Hoover and King only met face-to-face once. They agreed to sit down on Hoover's turf in Hoover's office and try to make peace.
Testing. 1, 2. All right.
King showed up. He brought a few of his closest advisors and aides with him. There was not press inside that office when they sat down together. By all accounts, Hoover kind of talked at them for a while. And then King emerged saying, you know, all good.
Did he apologize to you or in any way indicate regrets for what he had said?
Well, I must say that the conference was very friendly and that Mr. Hoover talked in a very amiable way, so that in a very friendly manner. The whole talk was very friendly, and I think he sought to get over to us some of the...
Do you feel your visit here then was a success, or how would you characterize it?
Well, I would say it was a success in the sense that I think we developed new levels of understanding. And as I said to him in the beginning, I felt that this was a basic necessity.
Did you specifically mention his comment about being a liar?
I think we'll have to end it here.
Ultimately, King and Hoover pretended to come to some sort of accord out of that, but it was a big controversy, and it was a polarizing controversy.
What do you think of Martin Luther King? Well, sir, I don't know. I read a lot about him.
I don't care for him. He's too bossy. Thinks he's too smart.
I think it was a very wonderful man trying to help our race.
Well, you know what Hoover thought about him.
He said he was the most...
10 times as bad as Hoover said.
Why do you feel that way, sir?
Well, just from all the trouble that he's caused in this country, all this rioting and things, I just think he's about the worst. If he is a human, about the worst in the world.
Probably my favorite public opinion poll, which tells us something about how radically different this moment was. In the aftermath of that showdown, fully 50% of the public sided with J. Edgar Hoover. Around 15-20% sided with Martin Luther King, and a bunch of other people said they weren't following it and didn't know. But Hoover was the universally beloved figure. King was the controversial figure, and I think we tend to forget that.
Hoover's accusations have more obviously been just a test by which he tested Dr. King's role and credibility in the eyes of the people after winning the Nobel Prize as a defender of peace. If we look at this FBI, whose operations are more like an organized criminal league, just like the Finnish police, who murder their own remand prisoners in their own prisons for financial cover, which is the murder policy of the White King of the Coalition, Sauli Niinisto, at its best. Chases problem citizens who are unprofitable to the state with authority powers to corrupt courts greased with cone elevator money to hear harsh sentences when these men tried to save their own wives from human rat farms owned by the state and managed by the University of Turku, whose nominal patients are fed chemical compounds that destroy brain functions and the immune system in the name of medically non-existent and imaginary diseases, and whose patients appear in Walter Major Helena's illegal medical studies, where Walter studies the effects of various chemical compounds on the brain at the cellular level, guesses the mechanisms of origin of an imaginary disease, and refutes previous guesses. In addition, the tasks of the Finnish police include giving false and baseless criminal investigation statements that lead to these medical human rat farms for the rest of their lives as medical human rats and natural resources. The FBI, whose mission has clearly been communist, when it has been protecting those in power, that no ordinary citizen would actually be able to take advantage of the promised fruit of democracy, i.e. the rise of ordinary people to the top of politics and where they would help their own people. The FBI, who must have been afraid of MLK Jr. getting into politics and how he could have succeeded in this with the help of his large support base, especially after winning the Nobel Peace Prize, which is not a fake model, like the ones of the former Finnish President Martti Ahtisaari, which were apparently bought with big money with the support of the United States when Ahtisaari was lobbying democracy to the African countries, where currently retired politicians of the coalition's murderous policy, such as Sue V. Linden, shop online for murders from their own diplomatic shelters, the background of which has been secured by the European Commission's Jutta Urpilainen, who controls this trade of African states as a commissioner, the value of which is 235 billion, which is such a huge amount that we will surely see other murderous policies of the coalition organized safaris to Uganda led by budding pharmacists like Sue V. Linden if someone from the core of power does not follow the policy of Sauli Niinisto, the White King of the Coalition. These Nobel Committee awards must have frightened the American rulers, which is why Hoover's accusations were published in the newspapers, which were just a game for the FBI director, with which he measured the people's loyalty to the American state agencies and the real value and credibility of MLK Jr. in the eyes of the people. Vietnam War. Lyndon tries to buy MLK Jr. approval for the war.
Triumph for freedom, as huge as any victory that's ever been won on any battlefield.
The triumphal passage of the Voting Rights Act really highlights what a close political alliance has developed between Martin Luther King and President Lyndon Johnson's administration.
Okay, hold on, please.
Hello? Hello? Yes, Dr. King.
Yeah, Mr. President, how are you today?
Oh, I'm doing pretty good. Now, you better get your thinking cap on this conference because we're going to have to rush it. We don't want to rush it too much. We want to have plenty of preliminary work on the panels and things. But you can see here that my Howard University speech wasn't any too early.
That's right. That's right. You said it right there. That's right.
But you put a little of that stuff in your thing. Refer that Howard University speech. Nobody ever publicized that.
Almost every speech I've made because I think it's the best
statement and analysis of the problem I've seen anywhere, and certainly no president has ever said it like that before.
But if you got any suggestions or recommendations, why, I'm just as close as a telephone. If you got enough money to pay it, if you haven't, why, I call collect.
All right.
Goodbye.
Lyndon Johnson, who knew that after assassinating John F. Kennedy in front of the Vietnam War, there was no one but Dr. King standing in front of the war, which is why he wrote the law initiatives on the side of black people and Dr. King, with which he hoped to get peace in the media for this war and for which all politics throughout the ages are based on.
Increasingly now, Americans are functioning directly in the fight for freedom in this far, foreign corner of the earth. The risks are real.
We intend to convince the communists that we cannot be defeated by force of arms or by superior power. They're not easily convinced.
When Martin Luther King Jr. first speaks out publicly against the Vietnam War in August 1965, he quite quickly is forced back into line by hostile criticism directed at him by Democratic allies of President Johnson.
We will not be forced out of South Vietnam.
And so King then remains silent about Vietnam for almost 18 months.
During our tour in the Republic of Vietnam, we have all seen what communism can do to a struggling nation in our world community.
When King is on his way to Jamaica in early 1967, and while waiting for a flight, he buys some magazines in an airport gift shop. And in an issue of Ramparts magazine, he sees a whole series of photos about the impact of U.S. Air Force napalm bombing on Vietnamese civilians. Nonviolence for King was not simply a civil rights protest tactic. King believed that nonviolence was a Christian ethic that should be applied around the world, not just by black demonstrators.
Let us pray.
Only in early 1967 does King's conscience begin to so trouble him about his prolonged silence that he forces himself to go public once again, knowing full well that in doing so, it will break his political alliance with Lyndon Johnson and bring down very widespread political criticism on his head.
And of course, it's always good to come back to Riverside.
The worst press that Martin Luther King received, I think, in his lifetime was exactly 1 year before his assassination.
I come to this magnificent house of worship tonight because my conscience leaves me no other choice. A time comes when silence is betrayal. That time has come for us in relation to Vietnam.
He reminded President Johnson he could count. How was there going to be any money for the war on poverty when all the money that was being set aside for the war on poverty was being spent to build bombs?
You know, America is a rich nation. Richest nation on the face of the earth. Now, you know what's wrong? Our national priorities are mixed up. And I'm afraid the national administration of our country is more concerned about winning the war in Vietnam than winning the war against poverty right here in the United States.
He was attacked from coast to coast, simply from describing the world as it really is. And And this was not the racist Southern press. This was the New York Times and the Washington Post and the LA Times. And, you know, I mean, everybody blasted him for having an opinion.
King went to communist training school, and I don't want anything to do with communists.
Are you sure of this?
Look right here.
Is that your only proof?
We have proof, and we are satisfied that it's true proof.
When he publicly spoke out against the war that persons he had known had been close to, for years turned against him.
And we don't see any reason for downgrading civil rights and elevating the peace movement above it, especially the indignities our people are suffering. The main show for us is right here, civil rights.
Yeah, he was hurt and depressed, and he, you know, the pressure of the home and his marriage and so forth. You know, it was getting to him.
It wasn't that he was right or wrong. He didn't have any business having an opinion. See? He realized how sick this country was. And he felt that he couldn't slow down, and he had to push on regardless.
I weighed the criticisms that I would get. Yes, sir. I thought about even the fact that some Negroes wouldn't understand, and some respectable Negro leaders who are more concerned about being invited to the White House than invited to the cause of justice would be against me.
In the wake of Dr. King's Riverside Church speech, Lyndon Johnson's White House very explicitly identifies King as a major threat to the president's policies.
I'm convinced that it will lead to widespread discontent and disenchantment with the administration if there isn't a change in the policy and an all-out effort to de-escalate the war and bring an end to it.
Now, Lyndon Johnson's White House had always been privy to the FBI's sexual surveillances of Dr. King. But now, Lyndon Johnson comes to view Martin Luther King as an enemy. And the FBI is eager to strengthen its own relationship with President Johnson by jumping on this anti-King bandwagon with greater fervor.
I just got word that Martin Luther King will give a press conference at 11 o'clock this morning in Atlanta. King was told by Levinson, who is his principal advisor and who is a secret communist, that he has more to gain nationally by agreeing with the violence that is coming out against it. That's the substance of information. We got that highly confidentially over the technicals. And I'll have for you tomorrow that memorandum you want on all the riots in the country.
That's right, and I want you to keep your men busy to find the central connections. But I wouldn't be a damn bit surprised that this poverty group here is not stirring up some of this.
We'll dig into that very thoroughly.
All right, okay.
Fine, thank you, Mr. President.
So many resources are mobilized against suppressing dissent in the U.S.
Opposition to the Vietnam War. I don't have time to put my meager resources into researching the Vietnam War, but it would seem that the American military only prolonged the outcome that Vietnam drifted into after the United States signed the Paris Peace Accords in 1973. This war was therefore a completely pointless waste of money and human lives, which in numbers would have been much smaller if the USA had not gone to this war, and in front of which the greatest men on earth had to give up their own lives. And where could they have taken humanity without such senseless wars that only result in corpses in garbage bags, by the millions? The Vietnam War, where America took its troops in 1965, is a clear sign why John F. Kennedy was assassinated in front of this war, and what victim MLK Jr. became when he started protesting to speak for ending the war. The Vietnam War that separates the rats from the heroes, and it was a pleasure for me to see how a person as blackened by the FBI as Dr. King was, and where sensitive matters of private life were spread around America, proved what the real heroes of humanity like Dr. King, John F. Kennedy and Sophie Scholl are made of. These true heroes of humanity defend humanity over their own weaknesses and their own spirits, like Dr. King or Sophie Scholl, in front of whom rats like Lyndon Johnson would run to bomb shelters with the white king of the coalition Sorlini Inisto when they should stain their own legs or if they burn a little of their own skin. Dr. King, who had been allowed to taste the White House twice and to be on good terms with Lyndon Johnson, broke this political alliance in the face of the horrors of Vietnam, in front of which Europe's new plague, the Black Death of problem citizens, a double agent who defected to the Kremlin's tables, the White King of the coalition and the new rise of the Aryans, a little bit Waco Sorlini Inisto would not only assassinate Marjolaine Inisto in collaboration with Finnish police robbers such as Kari Tolvanen, Cheri Aunio, Kijo Vilhunen and Juha Rautaimo, but he would even put his current wife, Jenny Hawkio, in an accident in front of these good relations to White House, just like the Finnish Tuomas Trasvuori was sent all the way to Uganda to be murdered, and I don't know why. The Vietnam War as a motive for the murders. The actions of the Vietnam War revealed the true methods of action of the US decision-makers and the FBI, as well as the core of the entire political playing field, i.e. war and the use of military force in situations that make no sense. I don't wonder at all why John F. Kennedy opposed the Vietnam War, because even in this situation, the war was nothing more than slowing down the inevitable and only causing higher casualty figures. United States Press. Although the FBI distributed wiretapping tapes of Dr. King to the US press, apparently hoping that someone would publish them. However, the American press did not stoop to this. Only when Dr. King began criticizing the United States for the Vietnam War did it aggressively attack Dr. King, which only proves how the US decision-makers have connections and influence over the US press, through which a media war is waged in the pages of newspapers with those who oppose the war, which spills over to the side of justifying the war. Press in Finland. If you look at the press in Europe and especially in Finland, where it is part of massive state propaganda, which means lobbying the people for medically non-existent and imaginary diseases, by attracting problem citizens who are unprofitable to the state to come to psychiatric clinics to discuss their problems in the hope of a new life, but where there is nothing but the deaths of problem citizens in inexplicable ways. Reporting a false picture of the war in Ukraine, which looks every day like a war agreed behind closed doors, in the name of which European member states can launder money from the state budget into funds in tax havens, where it can be distributed by state decision makers to their own projects wherever they happen to be, and use the bad condition of the state as a reason to take the money out of the lives of the poor people. I quickly say that Finland has no interest in helping the Ukrainians when already within its own borders it is engaged in its own silent ethnic cleansing of its unprofitable citizens who are literally murdered in medical clinics, and where they are lured to come with the help of YLE's propaganda machines, positive reporting, and in police prisons. This financial support of Ukraine simply does not make any sense based on the actions of Finnish decision makers if it is not money laundering in the name of the war in Ukraine. Finland, which has turned the courts into fighting holes for journalists of the state's propaganda machine, where they go to seek court decisions for prearranged disputes whose purpose is nothing more than to scare the people at the expense of freedom of speech, and what can happen in Finland if you open your mouth in the media if you are not satisfied with the coalition's murder policy, which leads to many unprofitable for the state to the premature death of a problem citizen. The state's own employees like Jessica Aro, who is fighting in the Finnish courts with topics of her own choosing and planning, are particularly active in these cage fights in the courts. Aro, who was fighting in the Finnish court, just like YLE journalist Johanna Veku against Oulu City Councillor Junes Locker, about freedom of speech in both cases, it can be said that the cases turned in favor of YLE's propaganda machine journalists, which are both owned by the White King of the Coalition and Little bit Waco Salinianisto. Finnish courts, which are known to me for their wrong judgments, and the state's own employees, who go to its holes to fight with their fabricated cases, who have no other purpose than to convince the people of right and wrong, where the court's decisions represent the absolute truth. Hanna Pahaniemi, the former editor-in-chief of Kalajokistu newspaper and deputy member of public speaking, is a good example of the kind of people who are recruited into Finnish organizations. When I contacted her regarding official corruption, in connection with which Pahaniemi gave me nothing but her own sentences to go to mental hospital from her work phone, Hila Group tells me what is being done in the name of these mental hospitals in Finland, i.e., they drive problem citizens who are unprofitable to the state into them, like Jews to Auschwitz, to fuel the academic careers of University of Turku researchers Walter Major Helena. Apparently, anyone can be sent to these Finnish mental hospitals, when a massive cooperation pattern is gathered in the background of these individuals, which includes medical psychiatry, whose statements can be used to feed these problem citizens with harsh chemical compounds that reduce and destroy brain functions, which makes it easier to drag them to mental hospitals. The Finnish police, who look at this activity as a furnace from the sidelines and blesses false criminal investigation statements, which lack a motive, which is a prerequisite for a place in a mental hospital in Finland. In Finland, however, I have stood up to defend these problem citizens caught in the clutches of the state's illegal activities, who are wanted by the state to run a human rat business, whose staged patients act as human rats in medicine and fuel Walter Major Helena's academic career, and on social media I have encountered strong resistance, apparently from supporters of this illegal activity, who are trying in every way to silence me and void my word with completely baseless claims against me, calling me a crack user. Assassination of Martin Luther King Jr.
Good evening. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, 39 years old and a Nobel Peace Prize winner, and the leader of the nonviolent civil rights movement in the United States, was assassinated in Memphis tonight. A sniper's bullet cut down Dr. King as he stood on a hotel balcony in Memphis.
A special bulletin flashed on the television that Dr. King had been shot. And I just stood there, you know, a long time. And then a little while later, they said Dr. King was dead. And I was angry. And there's a whole lot of other people were angry.
I was looking through the peephole of the glass. As I was watching Dr. King, I saw him look over toward the boarding house. And then whenever he looked back, like he was going to look into the parking area, that's when he come up off of the grating, and that's when he was shot. I would say I was the only one that saw him get shot, actually get shot from the front. And it's not no pleasant sight. I felt very bad inside that this had to happen in Memphis, Tennessee.
The shame of fireman George Lonarchy watching Dr. Martin Luther King through a police spy hole at the moment of his death was soon to be shared by many as the weight of world condemnation came down on the city of Memphis on the 4th of April, 1968. This was the killing of a major world figure. How could they have allowed it to happen? There were even suspicions that the Memphis authorities were accessories to the murder and involved in a cover-up. Over 20 years later, the man convicted of King's murder, James Earl Ray, still protests his innocence. In this film, we show new evidence that there was indeed a conspiracy and that the trail leads into the heart of government itself.
Your position is that you are completely innocent?
Yes. I don't have no responsibility for it. I did commit certain, they'd probably consider criminal offenses, but they were nothing serious. I probably wouldn't got over 5 or 10 years for them, aggregated.
Would you say that those criminal offenses were related to the case?
No, most of them are related. See, I escaped from Missouri prison in July 1967 and went to Canada. Most of them are related to that, false driver's license and fictitious names and all that type of thing, and there's nothing really serious.
Obviously, an individual had to pull the trigger. I'm not 100% sure if it would be James Earl Ray. I really don't see how that could be the case. It's possible, but I believe there was involvement by James Earl Ray, but what the magnitude of the involvement was, I don't know. I think there were a number of forces. I always say the forces of evil. Who that represented, I really don't know. I would hope that it wouldn't be the government.
You see, when there's an assassination, you have to have a lone nut, because a lone nut can kill somebody for no reason. If you admit that 3 or 4 people were involved, or that there was, to use an overworked term, conspiracy, then you have to say, well, the conspiracy had a reason. Well, they don't ever want to face that reason. What was the reason why Kennedy was killed? What was the reason why King was killed? By having a lone nut, you don't have to ask that question.
We concluded that James Earl Ray was, in fact, the person who murdered Dr. Martin Luther King. We also felt that, in all probability, there was a conspiracy. However, we were unable to name any conspirators.
Martin Luther King Jr. was shot from the Bessie Brewer's bathroom window, and which I talk about later. Setting up a crime scene. Since it is an assassination ordered by the highest decision-makers of the state, a lot of effort has been spent to cover up its traces, especially in the case of Dr. King, because solving this murder on my part was much harder work than, for example, John F. Kennedy. Dr. King's assassination, which brought me gray hair and long evenings at the computer, unlike any stumbling by the Finnish police or even the fake kidnapping of Minna Nurminen, which is by Finnish standards the most demanding case that I have solved, not because it is forensically well staged, but because a normal person still understands kidnapping for money, but self-engineered fake kidnapping where the kidnapper is paid to take the blame is something that goes beyond the consciousness of many working people, especially when it is done by the richest family in Finland. But these have been a really good exercise for me and prepared me for solving these murders on the United States soil. In the JFK case, the cover role of Lee Harvey Oswald was much easier to see, which was revealed by Oswald's overhyped and imaginary intelligence, which only means in my eyes that the CIA and the FBI had developed their processes in assassination cases after the case JFK, when it was able to build a cover-up role for James Earl Ray at such a short notice that was much more difficult to explain than for Lee Harvey Oswald, even though he ventured all the way to Russia. In Oswald's case, the crime scene was set up in the book depository where Oswald worked and which, as libraries, at least in Finland, are owned by the state and municipalities and thus very dependent on the state and municipality leaders, who can get to work in these places if there is a need to intervene from a higher authority. There is no way Lee Harvey Oswald could have gotten a job 38 days before Kennedy's assassination after all the speeches he made at his previous jobs. The book depository became the best line to shoot JFK from the motorcade, just as Bessie Brewer's bathroom became the ideal line to shoot Dr. King. The prerequisite for the assassination of Dr. King has been the ideal locations of these two hotels relative to each other in terms of assassination, which inevitably leads to the next question: who was aware of the assassination of Dr. King and his arrangement at the Lorraine Motel, just as John F. Kennedy was driven past the book depository, where Lee Harvey Oswald was ready to shoot JFK, but I discuss this in more detail in my upcoming video, The Assassination of John F. Kennedy. The clearest reference to the setting up of the murder scene and the furthering of the assassination plan has been the withdrawal of police patrols from the vicinity of Dr. King, approximately 24 hours before the murder, in this case from the Lorraine Motel, so that Earl Ray is only seen by those who know about the assassination of Dr. King, and that Earl Ray is far away when the assassination of Dr. King is revealed, and there is as much speculation as possible around the case: who was the shooter and where the fatal shot was fired.
Are we beginning to pull back the veils of conspiracy and cover-up among the authorities? Consider the actions of the Memphis Police Department.
Usually, when King would come to Memphis, well, even I, if he was at the church or something, we would, maybe I'd have maybe 20 men within that block. He had plenty of security. We knew he was coming. We'd have men at the airport to meet him, and we tried to give him all the security that we could give him.
If security was always supplied to Dr. King, why was the 7-man police unit attached to him stripped away only 24 hours before the assassination? Under close questioning from the House Assassinations Committee, Memphis Police Director Frank Holloman denied that he had authorized the removal or had known about it at the time. On top of that, it's a matter of public record that 3 12-man police tactical units were pulled back 5 blocks from the vicinity of the Lorraine Motel on the morning of the assassination.
Now, on this occasion, the TACCAR units were withdrawn at some point on the day of the 4th of April, weren't they?
No, my cars was never withdrawn. About April 4th. No, we still had cars in the area.
Wasn't there some suggestion that they were pulled back at the request of one of Dr. King's party, that they were pulled back a number of blocks?
No, to my knowledge now, and the only way they'd been pulled back was on my command.
Philip Melanson, author of the recent book The Merkin Conspiracy, has made a special study of this issue.
I questioned Sam Evans about the withdrawal of the tactical units because this was a very important matter. Evans told me clearly and forcefully that the tactical units were withdrawn at the request of the Reverend Samuel Kiles, a man in King's entourage, and that he, Evans, had received the order, the request from Mr. Kiles, and had acceded to it. And he told me that flatly 2 years ago.
Could Melanson's book refresh Sam Evans' memory?
No, I didn't pull my men back.
Why is Sam Evans now being evasive on this important issue? Is it because the official excuse for removing the tacked cars just does not ring true?
For someone in the SCLC to have instructed, quote-unquote, the Memphis police to move back those tactical units would be laughable in that situation, and it's absurd to think that the Memphis Police Department would have acceded to that request. These tactical units were riot control forces that were there to keep the lid on the Lorraine and monitor King, and if he or anybody in his party had told them to move back, I think they would have increased the surveillance net or begun to look more sharply for trouble. It's unthinkable that they would simply be that accommodating.
Colonel Fletcher Prouty was Chief of Special Operations for the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon in the 60s. When Kennedy was killed, Prouty resigned, suspecting an enemy within.
The policemen are taught to go to where there's been a murder and solve the murder. And just consider either of the Kennedy cases or the King cases, the thing you notice most is that the police stood with their hands down and did nothing. There were no on-the-spot detectives. There was nobody really looking into the ballistics. There was no one checking any of the things that the police would have gotten into in the first place. So there's where you begin to see the cover-up pattern. Somebody has told the police department, stay away from this. Now, they don't tell them that way. They say, look, because this was Mr. King in town, we have a special group of Secret Service or a special group of whatever here. And so the police think, well, it's covered, we're not needed. But in any event, they're away. Now, in Dallas, I know for a fact myself that there was an Army unit we intended to use in Dallas for protection on the streets, simply to watch everybody, watch the windows, watch everything. The commander of that Army unit had received a call, very simple call, saying, we don't need your unit. He knows there are other units, so he thinks they're going to use somebody else's unit. The next day, he found out there were no units there. Well, it's too late then, you see. Who made the call to that colonel?
The environment where Martin Luther King died. If you look at this situation from a wider perspective, that is, in what kind of circumstances did Dr. King die, as well as who was surrounded by the FBI's covert agent, mainly because the Inspector Sam Evans had ordered his forces to fall back 5 blocks, in which he denies with excuses later, like the Apostle Peter denied Jesus Christ. The day when the FBI together with Memphis police succeeded in assassinating Dr. King, the crime scene was full of people in the close circle of Dr. King that may have been participated in some way in the assassination of Dr. King, and who were in the other hand FBI's covert agent under mission, like Muriel McAuliffe was, the kneeling man on the picture where Dr. King is lying. This crime scene, in other words, was full of policemen and FBI covert agents who, by default, murder these black people in the United States as a basic assumption. Both hoteliers, Bessie Brewer and Lorraine, were FBI informants. The kneeling man in the picture was Muriel McCullough, secret agent of CIA, a man who rose from poverty, and when I see him next to dead Dr. King, it tells me that this man has sold his soul to these United States agencies for money, and he might have had a small role in the assassination of Dr. King, maybe even making sure that Dr. King is talked about as much as possible while he's on the balcony so that Ed Redditt can shoot him. Conspiracy theories, which in Finland means a slightly different picture than in America, which I have studied these cases. Conspiracies that in Finland are inevitably associated with UFOs, because the Finns have never encountered such assassination projects. But how much evidence must be obtained in order for the FBI leadership and the highest leadership of the United States, i.e. Lyndon Johnson, to be held responsible for these murders like John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King? Remington gamemaster. According to common knowledge, Earl Ray bought his murder weapon a few days before for an extremely difficult assassination, which means that the person who assassinated Dr. King must have practiced shooting as much as possible, adjusting the scope to be able to fire an accurate fatal shot. According to common knowledge, the gun that murdered Dr. King was left in front of the Knipe Amusement Company, which contradicts my previous story about how such weapons are almost personal, which the user of the gun himself adjusts to suit himself. James Earl Ray, who bought a Remington gamemaster gun 5 days before the murder, leaves a big question mark as to where he has been and in between firing the gun to target the shots used. This purchased weapon cannot possibly be a murder weapon, because in this situation, when waiting for the right moment where Dr. King is taken out by murdering, everything must be ready, such as the weapon's alignments and numerous practice shots fired with that weapon and the shots required for learning purposes. These required actions could not have been carried out within a few days before the assassination of Dr. King, because it would have brought too much time pressure to the case, which would have only messed up the execution of the demanding assassination. Based on the above and the fact that there have been attempts to assassinate Dr. King elsewhere based on James Earl Ray's movements in the United States, there may have been more of these weapons purchased by Earl Ray, in my estimation maybe even 6, where in connection with the purchase of the 6th weapon, the assassination of Dr. King was successful to perform, in contrast to previous ones, which were obviously left undone if the situation was too susceptible to disclosure for some reason. This is due to the fact that the FBI never investigated the connection between the bullet and the gun by performing the necessary tests on it, because this gun in the possession of the FBI is not the gun used in the assassination of Dr. King, and the bullets fired from this gun do not match the bullet found on Dr. King.
I took several pictures of the bullet, including every land and crew. This is just one of them. I had been told that the bullet was so badly mutilated that identification would be impossible. There is a great amount of lands and crew area for comparison. I would say that the FBI's decision not to test fire the rifle when they want to see if a projectile came from a specific rifle was a very poor case of judgment. Their reasoning that it was mushroomed and distorted so badly that it was unsuitable for comparison purposes is absolutely ludicrous. It had excellent characteristics, and they should have tested it.
Was the FBI's failure to test the weapon just incompetence, or more ominously?
Only one bullet was found in the weapon found by the police, which is not a reasonable discovery in terms of the performance of the task when you look at how complex this murder of Dr. King has turned out to be, which clearly points to the FBI's activities in the background, which has the resources to build such complex cases that cannot be solved with the knowledge of ordinary citizen, and they also do not have the necessary authority powers to investigate these cases better. The gun that killed Dr. King has mostly had a full magazine of ammunition in case of if Dr. King does not fall with the first shot, and therefore the gun is a pump-action model with quick loading for ready to the next shot, just like the case of JFK, at whom 3 shots were fired, 2 of which hit Kennedy. Considering the fatal shot, almost perfectly hit bullet dropped Dr. King immediately to the ground, so no other shots were heard in connection with the incident, like the assassination of John F. Kennedy, where Kennedy was shot 3 times because Kennedy was in the sights for the required time based on the fact that he could not directly drop from the site after sitting in the car. This fact also speaks for the fact that the weapon found by the police is not the weapon used in Dr. King's murder, but a fake gun left in front of Kenai Amusement, according to eyewitnesses, by a white man, even though Dr. King's shooter was black Ed Redditt. The gun used in Dr. King's murder must have been melted down and molded into a new product. Remington rifle scope testing. The scope was 3 inches to the right on the test, which the panel suspected was caused by the gun being dropped in front of the Kenai Amusement Company. I personally believe that this cannot be due to this abandonment, as the gun was wrapped in a soft blanket that has protected the gun very well. This gun, which was bought 5 days before the assassination of Dr. King, must have fired the targeted shots with it within this time, for the scope to look even approximately correct. Of course, there is a big question mark as to whether the scope were intentionally left in the wrong place, because at that time it was already known that the gun would play its own role in connection with the assassination of MLK Jr., which is staging, so it has not had to be adjusted, and it is rather because of this that it is wrong. Fired bullet Q64. The bullet found in Dr. King's body was stored in the FBI's warehouse, which is apparently partially false evidence, so that the FBI agents themselves are not caught in the crimes that they carries out at the request of the top management of the state, such as planning the assassination of Dr. King and organizing it by creating the Memphis police Ed Redditt a chance for to shoot Dr. King. In other words, the Q64 bullet in the FBI warehouse that was taken from Dr. King's body has oxidized to an almost unrecognizable condition after 10 years of sitting in the FBI warehouse, so that it is difficult to tell if it was fired with the Q2 Remington gamemaster that was found in front of Kenai Amusement. The committee that was formed to investigate 10 years after the assassination of Dr. King was only presented with a microscope image of one groove, even though the Remington gamemaster has 6 grooves. The remaining 5 undescribed grooves of the bullet Q64 may not have any meaning if they are equally incompatible with the T2 bullets fired with the Q2 gun, which only proves that the bullet Q64 was not fired with the Q2 gun found in front of Canine Amusement, and whose incompatibility I do not have to prove with these microscopic photos of ballistics, because they have never even played any significant role in my criminal investigations as far as the shooter who killed Dr. King, Memphis Police Detective Ed Redditt, whom I have other evidence to prove his guilty. I bring up these ballistic microscope images only because they are part of a series of my evidence to which I prove that the FBI itself is guilty of the murders of these executives who were murdered in the 60s, whose evidence it has itself destroyed, and presents false and fake items from its own stockpiles as fictitious murder weapons, lest it itself be caught orchestrating these murders, and that false evidence leads to the FBI's chosen scapegoat, which in Dr. King's case is James Earl Ray. The shooting location is the bathroom. There is a lot of speculation about where the fatal shot was fired, which has even been helped by the statements made by Solomon Jones, the driver of Dr. King's car, to Memphis press reporter Wayne Chastain.
Solomon Jones, King's chauffeur, was standing under the balcony when King was shot.
I interviewed Solomon Jones in the lobby of the St. Joseph Hospital approximately about 7:05. This was the story he told all of us. As soon as the shot was fired, he looked out over the limousine. He saw a sniper with a white sheet on his face duck back down into the bushes. A few seconds later, he rose out of the bushes without the sheet, walked to the wall, jumped down from the wall. And you must understand that other people were coming out of the fire station at the same time, jumping from the wall. Solomon said this person he saw in the bushes joined in with the people jumping from the wall, jumped from the wall, walked on the premises, and he said he was scared.
New York Times reporter Earl Caldwell was staying in motel room 215 when he heard the shot.
What I saw, this man just very clearly rise out of these bushes. He was in sort of a crouched, stooping position. I did not see a weapon in this man's hands, but I saw this figure directly across from the motel. And also, of course, the man in the bushes was a white man. From the day of the assassination until this day, no police, no FBI agent has ever come to me and said, "What did you see?"
I don't believe the assassin was in the rooming house at all, and that this is just a part of this information.
So where do you believe the shot was fired from?
After considering this issue over many years and balancing the variety of factors, I think it's quite likely that the shot was in fact fired from behind the rooming house, under the cover, within the cover of the brush and the bushes at the rear of the rooming house.
There were many other people in this area where Dr. King died, and in my studies, Solomon Jones's statements have been baseless without any real facts investigated by the unbiased police investigators. Just like Earl Goldwell said, no police officer come to ask him nothing about this. But I can say as an independent crime reporter of Finland who is now investigating Dr. King's murder that I have heard Goldwell now, and there are nothing to investigate on these people as possible shooters because of the bad location of committing the shot. These baseless claims that the shot was fired from the bushes only create stalemates that only confuse more the people, but there are now a real investigator, namely me, to cutting wings to these baseless gossips, which of course is fine for state-paid lawyers like William Pepper and others whose actions I will discuss later. Since at this point it can be said that the FBI is behind these murders like John F. Kennedy and MLK Jr., where its role has been to organize, carry out and organize these assassinations. It is a big question mark whether the FBI deliberately put its own stalkers on the lawn of the Bessie Brewer's hotel just to create these stalemate situations which with state-paid lawyers can create confusing situations for future debates about who shot Martin Luther King Jr. and at the same time drags the true facts of Dr. King's assassination onto a lie, which of course guarantees that this assassination will never be solved. The shot from the bathroom is almost 100% true, supported by completely unbiased statements from Bessie Brewer's dorm tenants such as Charles Quitman Stevens, who was in the kitchen when he heard the rifle shot, which he was able to point at the dorm bathroom. The shot fired from the bathroom is also supported by the fact that just like John F. Kennedy's fatal shots were fired from the best place, i.e. from the book depository window, and Bessie Brewer's bathroom was the most ideal connection to the balcony of Dr. King's room. The bathroom window has been the best connection to the hotel where MLK Jr. was to fire the fatal shot. Also, this bathroom together with Bessie Brewer's rooming house has guaranteed a safe exit from the murder scene to the other side of the block.
This is the wrapping that was in when it was sent up to the bureau, the box. This is it. It's a Remington.
This is probably the most crucial exhibit in the case. The rifle is so well guarded by the authorities that it's never been filmed before. Where's the evidence that this rifle killed Dr. King? We invited one of the most renowned ballistic experts in America, Herbert McDonald, to review the ballistics evidence in the actual bathroom from where the shot is alleged to have been fired. He's using an identical rifle.
I'm standing on the floor, and the bathtub is no longer in this physical configuration. With this setting, with this scope on this rifle and that window at 3.5 inches, I'm looking partially into the window, but that only cuts the light down very slightly. I have a very excellent view of the balcony. With this scope, it would be an easy shot for someone like myself who knows how to breathe and position themselves for a shot and to very gently squeeze the trigger. An inexperienced person, it would be a more difficult shot, considerably more difficult, especially standing in the bathtub.
The only piece of physical evidence that appeared to link the rifle to this bathroom was a dent in the windowsill.
That is the exact width and length of an indentation that I examined in the windowsill in Memphis in 1974. The dent, therefore, since it has no microscopic characteristics, it has no individual characteristics, and certainly does not reflect either the geometry or any of the microscopic scratches on the barrel. They just would not be reproduced. This dent could never have been made by this weapon.
And the point about the dent is that it was used to demonstrate as evidence that the rifle was fired from this room. They said there's a dent from the rifle on the windowsill, therefore it was fired from this room.
That's ridiculous. That dent does not prove anything.
In John Edgington's documentary, the connection between the murder weapon and the bathroom is falsely tried to be brought out with the help of a leaf that would have been left by the gun. Such an action is completely baseless and a deliberate attempt to hide the real crime scene from the eyes of the people. Bessie Brewer's bathroom must have been full of dents that have nothing to do with the gun, and it's amazing how out of the thousands of dents in this bathroom, a single dent can be singled out in an attempt to cut the connection between the murder weapon and the crime scene. If I were to take a similar stance, I could say that Herbert McDonald, who appeared in the documentary, is holding a completely wrong weapon, which is not even a pump-action model. This could be a completely unjustified refutation of the second statement if you consider that maybe Herbert McDonald uses a different weapon just for the purpose of illustration. In this section, I will tell you on a small scale how the FBI and United States government covers up crimes with the lawyer-like dirty actions. It is a big question mark how precisely these people have been chosen on behalf of the FBI and United States government to present their misleading statements with the wrong model of weapons. But in this case the truth is deliberately being dragged to the side of the lie with the help of a vague dent that can tell practically nothing next to thousands of other dents. This action is apparently an attempt to disprove the witness statements of Bessie Brewer's dormitory, which are of far greater value than the individual dents among the thousands of other dents in the bathroom. The bathroom, which according to witness statements has been the scene of the shooting, supported by its good location to the Lorraine Motel and the exit completely on the other side of the block. Herbert McDonald tries to disprove this with a single dent found in the bathroom, and how William Pepper tries to disprove the bathroom's involvement with some vague eyewitness account of a person who now it just happens to land from the bushes without a weapon top of all. I, as a criminal investigator, clearly see that Pepper has been selected for this position by a carefully selected government-paid lawyer whose job it is to guard the truths of the assassination of Dr. King and draw them on purposely false assumptions so that this case remains a mystery and the United States agencies are not held accountable for the murders of their leaders. In these cases, it must also be taken into account that this situation is entirely due to the actions of the FBI and other police officers, which definitely includes standing with their eyes closed and, worst of all, participating in the assassination of Dr. King by arranging and organizing it. If the FBI really wanted to solve the murder of Dr. King, last thing is to put your only eyewitness who saw and recognized the shooter on the corridor of Bessie Brewer's to the mental ward for 10 years. But is there any good solution for the FBI, whose agent were the main player of this assassination of Dr. King? Shooter. According to common knowledge, the shooter would be James Earl Ray, which contradicts the eyewitness accounts and at the least how the FBI is dealing with these eyewitnesses, such as extortion, threats, bribery, and finally, when individuals do not recognize James Earl Ray as the murderer, they are committed to a mental institution for 10 years so that their word cannot be used in any courts. Charles Quitman Stevens, a rooming house tenant who occupied room 6B, maintained in a sworn affidavit given on the 13th of June, 1968, that on 2 or 3 occasions during the afternoon of the 4th of April, 1968, he heard footsteps leaving room 5B and going past his room and into the common bathroom at the end of the hall 6. A second tenant, William Charles Anschutz, told FBI interviewers that during the afternoon of the 4th of April, 1968, he made 2 attempts to use the bathroom and found it occupied on each occasion. He recalled that Stevens told him, through the door of room 6B, that the bathroom was being used by the new tenant in 5B. This information became significant in light of the uncontroverted evidence that Ray did, in fact, rent room 5B on the afternoon of April the 4th. Neither Anschutz nor Stevens could recall for the committee details of these bathrooms visits by the occupant of room 5B, but Stevens noted in a sworn statement that at the time of the assassination, he was seated at the kitchen table in room 6B, when he heard a loud explosion that he recognized as a shot. After looking out the window toward the Lorraine Motel, he heard footsteps running in the hallway. He went to the door, opened it, looked out and observed a man with something under his arm turning the corner at the end of the hallway. Stevens was sure the individual had come from the bathroom adjoining his apartment because of the loudness of the shot. Stevens' sobriety on the afternoon of April the 4th was called into question by a number of sources, and the committee did not rely on his testimony for an eyewitness identification of the assassin. It believed that he was sober enough, however, to determine that a loud explosion had occurred nearby and that he saw a man fleeing down the hallway. Similarly, Anschutz heard a shot, opened his door and saw a man fleeing down the hallway from the direction of the bathroom. James Earl Ray, the Patsy Killer. Miraculously, the FBI managed to track down its own scapegoat, even if its actions is almost like a déjà vu from the stories of the Finnish blue team of stupids, whose investigators, Marko Mäkinen and Johanna Lassila, I have filed a criminal complaint for the murder of Eva-Kaisa Nicola, which they murdered in their own remand prison, which was framed as a suicide done by Eva-Kaisa herself, which in action is indeed as crooked as the actions of the FBI in the 60s when it eliminated the enemies of Lyndon Johnson in the United States by murdering them. James Earl Ray, whose fingerprints were found on a gun that the FBI's own agents had left in front of the Kenai Amusement Company. This roller coaster from the 60s reminds me so much the activities of the Finnish blue team of stupids and is the reason why I am so good what I do. Earl Ray, who secretly smuggled weapons and other stuff at the behest of the imaginary Raoul, has turned out in my criminal investigations to be the FBI's own agent, and under whose direction James Earl Ray followed Dr. King to different parts of the United States, wherever the FBI had built an environment where Dr. King could be assassinated and which all the enablers of the assassination can get away, and James Earl Ray is made a real killer in the eyes of the people, just like Lee Harvey Oswald in connection with the assassination of John F. Kennedy. The adventures of James Earl Ray on the soil of the United States are, of course, extremely poorly documented journeys that it is difficult to connect them with Dr. King's travels precisely. If you look at the trip between California and Atlanta, for example, Earl Ray has not driven this trip by car, but he has most likely flown by plane in between, which means that at the very least, there have been more white Mustang cars in these states in case this assassination is carried out. But why these scapegoats take the murders on their own shoulders, I will discuss at the end of the article. Killer is Memphis Police Detective Ed Redditt.
In Memphis, there is evidence that the Secret Service did influence the activities of the police. Ed Redditt was a detective in a surveillance post at the fire station.
So you can see the balcony, you can see all of the courtyard, like the office, all the way down the corner of the building. You can see everything around the building. Lieutenant Arkin arrived and stated I was wanted to headquarters. I said, for what? He said, I don't know, just get in the car, let's go. I was told to bring you back. As I viewed the room, there appeared to be numerous law enforcement people from all of the various agencies, local, county, state, and nationally. Director Frank Holloman stated that the man standing across from me was Secret Service from Washington, stating that there was a contract out on my life. At that time, he told Lieutenant Arkin to take me home and wait until someone arrived to guard me. Once we arrived at my house, while seated in the car, awaiting the security for me, being there, I imagine no more than 5 or 10 minutes, the radio blasted out Dr. King had been shot.
From various sources, we've been able to piece together that the information about the assassination attempt on Detective Redditt did indeed come direct to Chief Holloman from a Secret Service man in Washington. This departmental communication reveals that by 4:15 that afternoon, Lieutenant Arkin of the Memphis Police Department had been alerted by a phone call from the FBI that the assassination threat attributed to Redditt was a mistake. So why was Chief Holloman sending Redditt home at 5 p.m., 3/4 of an hour later? He testified to Congress that he was not told of the mistake at that time. Lieutenant Arkin, then head of the Police Intelligence Unit, can have no such excuse. He received the phone call and then personally took Redditt home. The reasons for his actions are unexplained. He refused to be interviewed for this program.
The Redditt affair represents the distraction of the Memphis Police Department by a false intelligence report from Washington that was inputted into the Memphis Police Department within hours before the assassination, and that seemed to have distracted everyone in the department to the extent that they were off on missions and having meetings, and that's very significant. The fact that Redditt had a different assignment is not the entire affair. Where that information came from about a false threat, why and how it was taken seriously, and what its distraction factor was, is the importance, and I think that has yet to be fathomed.
In the famous Lau photograph of associates of Dr. King pointing away from the motel and toward the rooming house. There was for a long time a mystery about the person who was kneeling over Dr. King checking him for life signs. That person was Merrill McCullough, who somehow, when hearing the shot, instantly streaked up the stairs to the balcony and checked Dr. King. He was an undercover operative for the Memphis Police Department, but reporting directly to an intelligence officer of the Memphis Police Department.
Part of a web of covert action conducted by the security forces in Memphis, Merrill McCullough was just one of the shadowy figures involved. We learned from a police source that the owner of the Lorraine Motel was a police informer. So was Dr. King's chauffeur. The FBI had informers among black groups in Memphis and in the heart of King's party, the SCLC. This hidden network was partially revealed in a secret intelligence report written by Lieutenant Arkin. Apart from McCullough, codenamed Max, the report also discloses another agent, as yet unidentified, codenamed Bill. Whether these spies had a sinister purpose is unclear. Certainly they failed to prevent the assassination. A decade later, the Memphis Police Department was still concealing their actions, providing the House Assassinations Committee with a version of the report that was clearly doctored.
Congressman, would it surprise you if a document supplied to your committee by the Memphis Police Department had in any way been sanitized or doctored?
It would surprise me because I'm not aware of any document given our committee by the Memphis Police Department that was sanitized or doctored.
The secret intelligence report was definitely doctored. The version that I got, which was the original version, was fuller and material was excised for the congressional report. It leaves out crucial details such as Mr. McCullough and his spying role. It leaves out many of the other details, and it factors in things that didn't happen in the original data.
Links between the police and the FBI were unusually strong in Memphis. Not only was Fire and Police Chief Holloman running the Memphis FBI in the early 60s, but he also worked for 7 years in charge of the office of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover.
First of all, I like to tell that Philip Melanson is the state-paid lawyer whose mission is to protect the real truth behind the assassination of Dr. King. Just like William Pepper, and this threat call was not meant to cause a disturbance, but was the main action of highly planned operation of with the help of Ed Redditt was retrieved from the fire station with the help of a false threat call, and on the basis of it, which formed his alibi for the murder of Dr. King, which has endured fire and water all these years but whose time has come to melt. And as for Melanson, I will discuss him more at the end of the article. Such activities have been the FBI's core activities and what its entire activities are based on. The FBI's assassination projects, the trigger of which is a signal from the highest place, i.e. the White House of the United States. This kind of activity in a democratic state is more of a dictatorial activity, which is difficult to prove because the FBI as the highest authority is able to cover up its own illegalities and only proves how countries are run from influential positions whose wishes the FBI fulfills, and what has become its core activity until today, which I will tell more about later. The murderer of Martin Luther King Jr. is Memphis Police Detective Ed Redditt, who was taken away from the police surveillance post that was built up at the fire station, next to the Lorraine and Bessie Brewer's motels, with a fake threat call made by the FBI themselves. So how do I know for sure that Ed Redditt is the murderer? These murders and their perpetrators, although there are more than James Earl Ray who take the blame for it, even this group is surely small, because it is not enough for a person to execute another, and especially when it is an iconic leader of black people who should be killed only for moral reasons. The person must be extremely sick, unlike Dr. King. When I found out that Dr. King's murderer is Ed Redditt, it was no surprise that it was the police, because the police are behind many murders against blacks, and it has proven that the police in the United States are capable of murdering people. But what came as a surprise to me was that it was a black person. But as I progressed in my criminal studies, this was no longer such a surprising thing. But I will discuss it later in the MLK Jr. murder, Part 2. Alibi. Ed Redditt is best exposed by the alibi created for him, which was made with a false threat that was made at 16:15, but Redditt was not sent home until 17 o'clock. Since this murder has been the main purpose, which cannot be directly controlled by any bureaucracy, but carrying it through is more of an activity led from the field and trying to get the bureaucracy to fit with its flow. That's why it also leaves gaps in the case, as I said above. This time of 17 o'clock is also the only thing where James Earl Ray has not caused a contradiction in his story throughout his life, like all the others, reveals that the assassination of Dr. King has been a police-led operation and the role told by Earl Ray has been an undercover agent of the FBI, who has directed and advised Earl Ray where to go and at what time. So Earl Ray has been in Memphis, booked a hotel room there and left at 17 o'clock as he said, and Ed Redditt has come to Bessie Brewer's right after 17 o'clock when he just gathered and stayed waiting for Dr. King to leave to eat, which quite likely was an arranged meeting with this murder in mind, because the shooter was black. Ed Redditt and Dr. King completely surrounded by undercover agents of the FBI and CIA, who were quite certainly aware of this assassination and directed Dr. King Lorraine in the motel, for example by talking to him on the balcony so that Ed Redditt gets a good chance to shoot Dr. King. After the shot, all that happens, someone driven near the K-Nipe amusement store with white Mustang and leaving the fake Remington near it was done by the FBI agents itself, and it is the main reason why this murder of Dr. King won't solve with the help of the United States Police. I will talk more about Ed Redditt in connection with the testimony of Grace, who is the only person who saw Ed Redditt in the corridor of Bessie Brewer's running with a Remington gamemaster in his hand. Grace Walden Stevens. Grace Walden's testimony is proving to be of the greatest importance in my criminal investigations because it is the testimony of a completely impartial person, unlike, say, any state attorney like William Pepper or FBI tipsters, Ed Redditt who shot Dr. King. Grace Walden, who occupied room 6B as Stevens' common-law wife, gave a variety of conflicting statements with respect to her observations immediately after the assassination. Aside from Ray's own account of his actions on the 4th of April, 1968, the committee investigated other evidence that had been offered as exculpatory, including the testimony of Grace Walden Stevens, a tenant of Bessie Brewer's rooming house at 422.5 South Main Street, Memphis. Charles Stevens said he saw a man who fit the general description of James Earl Ray running down a hallway from the vicinity of the second-floor bathroom immediately after the shooting. It had been alleged that a third rooming house tenant, Grace Walden, who in 1968 was the common-law wife of Charles Stevens, saw a man who did not fit Ray's description fleeing down the hallway after the shooting. Walden described the man she had seen fleeing from the bathroom as short and wiry, with salt and pepper hair, wearing a colored plaid shirt, army jacket and with box. This box, which Grace Walden had seen in the hand of the shooter, namely Ed Redditt, has been a support used for sniping, which is almost necessary when one wants to shoot accurate aimed shots. Ed Redditt has had to lean against the bathroom wall during the shot and place the gun on the windowsill on top of the gun support or rest, one foot on the bottom of the bathtub and the other foot supported to the edge of the bathtub. There have been spread lots of false picture of the position when shooting, so that as much disinformation as possible floats over the truth of the case, distorting the truth and giving false pictures about how the shooting actually happened. Walden's most recent public statement, concerning the events surrounding the assassination, occurred on the 15th of August, 1978, edition of NBC Television's Today Show. She said, "Charlie picked James Earl Ray out. I don't think the man looked anything like him. In the first place, I think he was a nigger." This statement from Walden, which has been completely contradicted by the police's own fabrication, has started a massive action on the part of the state authorities which was aimed at Walden destroying a witness's account with a bribe. It had been alleged that a third-rooming house tenant, Grace Walden, who in 1968 was the common-law wife of Charles Stevens, saw a man who did not fit Ray's description fleeing down the hallway after the shooting. Further, it had been alleged that because Walden would not agree to sign an affidavit identifying Ray as the assassin, even though she was offered a $100,000 reward to do so, she was threatened by an FBI agent. Thus, there had been claims that a witness who could identify Dr. King's assassin as someone other than Ray was silenced in an effort by the government to convict Ray and conceal the identity of the true assassin. Walden interviewed in mental hospital by the police. Immediately after the shooting, Walden was interviewed by Lieutenant Glynn King and Captain R.L. Williams of the Memphis Police and later that evening at Memphis Police Headquarters. Because Walden refused to accept and acknowledge James Earl Ray as the shooter, she was initially taken to the John Gaston Mental Hospital to be interviewed by the police. After admission to the emergency room at John Gaston Hospital, Walden was examined by Dr. Mary Slichter, a staff psychiatrist, who concluded that she was suffering from psychotic depression and was dangerous to herself. Since she was diagnosed as exhibiting suicidal tendencies and presenting a danger to herself, a record of arrest, called for by Memphis police procedures in all similar cases, was filed for Walden at the hospital. The officers signing the arrest record stated unequivocally to the committee that no instructions were given by the Memphis Police Department, Shelby County Attorney General's Office, the FBI or anyone else to have Walden committed to the John Gaston Hospital psychiatric ward. Both officers indicated. She was interviewed later again on April the 5th and the 24th of April by FBI agents. The committee's investigation revealed that at none of those interviews did Walden claim to have seen anyone fleeing from the bathroom or running down the hall. These interviews seems to be done in the John Gaston Mental Hospital, so that any of these Grace Walden's statements can be used in courts if she does not agree with the murderer. Thus, by the 25th of April, 1968, Walden had said on numerous occasions that she did not see the man who exited the bathroom following the shot that killed Dr. King. In addition, a careful review by the Committee of Journalistic Coverage of the Assassination revealed numerous references to statements by Stevens and Anschutz, while there was no mention of any account by Walden. While there were references in Walden's medical records that noted she was a witness in the King case, the committee determined that the question of her possible status as a witness had no bearing on her commitment. During her stay at John Gaston, Walden complained that she continued to hear voices, and on the 29th of July, she attempted to hang herself with strips of bedding. Finland, these mental wards has become more like storage places for human rats of medicine, whose patients appear in the medical studies of researchers at the University of Turku. But these institutions also work in the smearing of people, after which the people can be murdered in complete peace by feeding them something chemically really toxic, which kills them and whose real cause of death the Institute of Health and Welfare will not find out and the police will not investigate them with necessary precision. In the Finnish court, this way, i.e. clients' reputation tarnished by psychiatry, are subjected to the most arbitrary action, which is almost impossible to fight against, because the word of these persons carries absolutely zero weight in the courts of Finland, which means that these persons can be sentenced to Finnish mental hospitals for the rest of their lives, for the use of the medicine and fuel for the academic careers of the researchers from the University of Turku such as Jarmo Hietala and Walter Major Helena. The lists of these institutions can fit a really motley number of different cases, of which I will present the death of Canis, the preparator of which has previously been taken twice to a closed psychiatric ward for involuntary treatment, and where he was recorded in the patient record that he hears voices, which in these cases are combined with voices that control the patients. The death of Canis, where the accused person, Jarkko Kalevi-Leppänen, was found guilty of the manslaughter of Timo Ingelsuo. This case in the Finnish courts is a complete fiasco, even in terms of the police's criminal investigation, and I won't bring it up so much here. Jarkko Leppänen has told the Court of Appeal that Timo Ingelsuo had come from behind and attacked him unexpectedly, which is why Jarkko Leppänen had fallen on ground. After Jarkko Leppänen got up, Timo Ingelsuo had, according to Jarkko Leppänen, come towards him with his fists raised. Jarkko Leppänen has said that he punched Timo Ingelsuo on the left cheek and that he fell as a result of the punch. Jarkko Leppänen has since asked Timo Ingelsuo the reason why he had attacked Jarkko Leppänen. As a result of the answers he received, Jarkko Leppänen had lost his temper and shook Timo Ingelsuo's jacket and hit Timo Ingelsuo, who was on the ground below, on the left cheek and sides. According to Jarkko Leppänen, the violence has not been intense. According to what he said, he had stopped the abuse as soon as Jarno Leppänen grabbed him by the shoulder and forbade him to continue the abuse. Finally, Jarkko Leppänen had lightly kicked Timo Ingelsuo in the leg and raised him to a sitting position. In the preliminary investigation, Jarkko Leppänen has also said that he punched Timo Ingelsuo hard in the nose at the beginning of the situation, and after he fell to the ground, Jarkko Leppänen continued the abuse with a strong blow to the left cheekbone. After this, he has said that he continued the abuse by hitting Timo Ingelsuo on the right and left side as hard as he could. Timo Ingelsuo's protection had dropped, and Jarkko Leppänen had caught Timo Ingelsuo's hands under his knees. After this, as described above, he had asked Timo Ingelsuo the reason for the attack. After this, he has said that he hit Timo Ingelsuo twice with force on the left cheekbone and that he grabbed him by the hair and lifted his head. Jarkko Leppänen has said in the preliminary investigation that Timo Ingelsuo had looked beaten and that he had felt pity for him. In the preliminary investigation, Jarkko Leppänen has still told about making Timo Ingelsuo sit up and kicking him in the same way as in the Court of Appeal. According to the statement of the cause of death, Timo Ingelsuo's head, neck, chest, stomach and limbs have been hit by several blunt blows, as a result of which the nose has been broken and the 4-9 ribs on the left side have been broken. According to the statement, there have been extensive bruises and superficial skin abrasions in the injured area, and Timo Ingelsuo has had small contusions on the mucous membranes of his mouth. In other words, Jarkko Kalevi-Leppänen had defended himself against Timo Ingelsuo, however with too much force, who, according to the report, had attacked Jarkko Kalevi-Leppänen from behind. Leppänen had left the place when Ingelsuo's attack had ended, but unfortunately Ingelsuo had died at the scene of the abuse, and his cause of death has been recorded as hypothermia based on the forensic report. Timo Ingelsuo's injuries from the abuse has not caused the death of Timo Ingelsuo, says the court's decision. Leppänen was convicted of manslaughter. Leppänen was sentenced in Finland for manslaughter, even though the person died of hypothermia based on the forensic examination. That is due to fact that Leppänen left Ingelsuo alone at the place where they had fought and where Ingelsuo died because of hypothermia. Court diminished responsibility. Because Leppänen had previously been in involuntary psychiatric treatment, where the psychiatrists was recorded that Leppänen hears voices, which in these cases, at least in Finland, are combined with voices that guide the patients. These statements in Finland have been outsourced as far as possible from the patient, which means that these people from the Health and Welfare Department, who distribute these mental illness statements, have not seen the patient before. In Finland, this board of the Health and Welfare Institution includes Jaana Suvisaari, who is distributing these mental illness statements to Finnish courts, whose word no living person in Finland can question, and which was seen with Jarkko Kalevi-Leppänen when he tried to say that these actions towards him were wrong. Even though Jaana Suvisaari has not seen these patients at the moment to whom she shares her mental illness statements, but she will see these people in a small country like Finland, some of whom also appear in Jaana Suvisaari's medical research conducted under the name of the University of Turku. Jaana Suvisaari has performed together with Jarmo Hietala and Walter Major Helena, when they have studied glial cell function in these medical human rats, which they collect for their own research from all state mental hospitals that are subject to involuntary treatment, which means that these medical human rats that appear in Jaana Suvisaari's in the examinations that he himself has sent to mental hospitals, to say the least, it sounds like a pirate business and completely biased judgments on the side of the human rat business of medicine whose patients has no possibility to refuse these medical examinations. Because of the previous patient records of Jarkko Kalevi-Leppänen, the Health and Welfare Institution has found Leppänen to be sent to involuntary treatment, even though the representatives of the Health and Welfare Institution have not even seen Jarkko Kalevi-Leppänen, who, according to his own words, has been wrongly taken to involuntary treatment at the first place, in connection with which there is false information about him by psychiatrists. Although Leppänen complained about the abuse done without guilt, this did not help, and Leppänen was sent for involuntary treatment to a prison mental hospital whose patients do not experience miraculous cures and who appear in the medical studies of Turku University researchers such as Jarmo Hietala and Walter Major Helena, where they study the effects of various chemical compounds on the brains of these medical human rats at the cellular level. With the help of guess the mechanisms of occurrence of medically non-existent and imaginary diseases and refute their previous guesses. Where is Jarkko Kalevi-Leppänen today? When I started investigating Jarkko Kalevi-Lepänen's case, it turned out that he somehow experienced a miracle cure in these medical human rat farms, contrary to the expert opinions of this field, which obviously dilutes all the opinions of these experts regarding these medically non-existent and imaginary diseases. Jarkko Kalevi-Leppänen, who has worked as a gym entrepreneur for about 2 years since his conviction, is really smart and has certainly never heard any of these voices that supposedly guide patients, from which we can clearly draw conclusions that these diseases do not exist and their operation is based on a lie and to intentional misrepresentation on the part of psychiatrists, which is strongly guided by the staging of these patients into a medically non-existent and imaginary disease, in the name of which researchers such as Jarmo Hietala and Walter Major Helena can study anything with these human rats of medicine. Misuse of medicine and its promotion in Finland. This activity in Finland has made me wonder if the Finnish courts behind closed doors make deals with these defendants, so that these cases can be used to target problem citizens when they don't really even understand where they are when the authorities run over them with the power of the law, just like Grace Walden Stevens in connection with the assassination of Dr. King. This kind of agreement can be seen in the case of Annie Laura, a woman who killed her husband but was convicted of sexually abusing her own children. This sentence was passed through the Finnish courts with the help of 51 psychiatrists, which I guess is the democracy advertised by the state's decision makers, i.e. a large number of false verdicts passed by a large number of judges, whose convictions were praised in the media by state university professors such as Dan Frandy and Terttu Utriainen, like the resurrection of Jesus, and I see no other reason for this than that an agreement has been reached with Aura regarding the sentence. For Aura, this is of little importance, what sentence will be given to her, because she did kill her husband, but for the Finnish authorities, such a false sentence, which the people also believe, is always one sentence closer to the dictatorship and the Nazi courts, whose sentences no longer care about the people, and when the media don't do nothing, even if it is a false sentence. After that, the Finnish courts, which are under the control of the decision makers, just like the Finnish police, who ran Europe's largest drug business from their own headquarters during the era of Giuliano and kills its own remand prisoners in their own prisons, which are so poorly staged as suicides that you can smell this illegal activity even through the media. You can send unprofitable citizens to the state as human rats in medicine through these corrupted courts with psychiatric expert opinions along this arbitrary route. Through the same line which Jarkko Kalevi-Leppänen was sent to a mental hospital, but which is nevertheless already on the free side of our society without judgment and as a gym entrepreneur. And the more Finnish courts give wrong verdicts, in the long run it becomes more as a rule than the exception. The case of Jarkko Kalevi-Leppänen also parallels other vague cases in Finland, such as the depression advertised by Jasmine Valtolainen, from which she fell ill, and the reporting of which has been made as misleading as possible so that the reader imagines that Valtolainen died of depression. In Valtolainen's case, the media and she do not talk at all about a medical illness such as cancer, from which many young Finnish women have died. Valtolainen is deliberately promoting depression and how you can die from it, completely omitting to tell about his medical illness such as the cancer from which he most obviously died. There is clearly a general opinion in Finland, which is even supported by the happy message of the Saleta Tilamat actress, Jasmine Valtolainen, who is a turnkey advertisement for the state in terms of the fact that it can hand out its death sentences in its own clinics, which is almost impossible to fight against when it is driven with such strong disinformation and fake news into the people's subconscious. Every approximates the witch persecution of the Middle Ages, which was inflicted on disadvantaged women in society, and which Valtolainen is doing now. This is, of course, from the point of view of the state's decision makers, the best news, under the guise of which it carries out the extermination of problem citizens who are unprofitable to the state in Finnish medical care clinics with the help of medicine, which in all its scope can be counted as ethnic cleansing, and indeed it is among citizens who are unprofitable to the state. And this national cleansing under the auspices of the White King of the Coalition and Little Bit Waco Soliniinisto does not only end with those sentenced to death, but part of the social contribution of these problem citizens is forcibly taken with the help of medicine when they have been provoked into an act that shocks society, which only falls even further on the necks of this new minority group, i.e. problematic citizens tarnished by psychiatrists, because the hate, which is caused by the last defense of these citizens who have been caught in the clutches of the Finnish authorities are used to accept all the illegal medical studies of Jarmo Hyatala and Walter Major Helena of the University of Turku. This activity is so widespread in Finland that Hasse Karlsson of the University of Turku has made it his life's mission to lobby for this depression to new medical students, whose brains are already implanted in the early days of their studies with the idea that you can die from depression, even though this is a complete lie and which Hasse Karlsson himself knows very well. But unprofitable and uneducated citizens do not know this and are left wondering how their friends die in Finnish medical clinics when they are directly murdered there, as happened to Jimmy Kartusen, whose post-trauma metabolic reaction was disturbed in every possible way by pumping all the drug antibodies into cartunin, which extinguished cartunin's vital functions. This was really a medicinal euthanasia and a murder that Chancellor Tuomas Poisti has overturned and dismissed. The criminal report I filed for murder is more than 2 years old, which means that in Finland even murder can expire if you ask Chancellor of Justice Tuomas Poisti when it comes to a citizen murdered by another authority who is not beneficial to the state. The citizens that are unprofitable to the state are left wondering how their friends die in Finnish medical care clinics when they are fed drugs used in cancer treatments for depression on an autumn day. Since Jasmine Voutilainen was not a problem citizen but a well-liked actress from a series Sale Tutilamat who has many friends, I have no reason to doubt that the Finnish medical care would have unjustifiably fed her cancer drugs for the autumn depression which she could not have had, at least based on her own personal life, but which could have been due to cancer, because it's certainly not nice for anyone to know that they have to leave here prematurely as young as Voutilainen was, unjustably. By the Mother Nature's choice, and that's certainly depressing. In other words, Jasmine Voutilainen has given her face to the fact that medical care is capable of murdering its problem citizens who are unprofitable to the state through medical abuse, which I do not accept, and why I have sided with these problem citizens murdered by Finnish medical care, just like my predecessor, the world's biggest woman who ever walked on this planet or any other, where Elon Musk sends his rockets, Sophie Scholl, who defend the Jews who were murdered in Germany in the 40s. And what the White King of the Coalition and a little bit Waco Sooliniinisto is doing in Finland, however on a much smaller scale through his own government agencies. The human rat business run by the states, which has developed so much since Joseph Mengel's time, that it is hard to see when these individual cases, such as the school killers, have been provoked by the drugs of psychiatry to commit acts that shock society, and the anger caused by the people accepts all illegal activities at the expense of the freedom and health of these human rats, just like the Nazi Hitler accepted his own illegal actions at Auschwitz with the Jew hatred he incited. In addition to all this, medically non-existent and imaginary diseases have been imposed on the credibility of these human rats of medicine, in the name of which all illegal activities are justified when the top medical researchers study the imaginary diseases of these human rats. Unclear cases as a whole. Finland, where medical care is outsourced to the patient's home, which is completely unsupervised, means Finnish citizens who are subjected to the arbitrary actions of the medical care, who are simply murdered by the medical care from spending taxpayers' money, using medicine in it, and which it also uses almost like a punishment, like with the person who died at home on a ventilator after the battery ran out when the nurse had passed out under the influence of alcohol in the patient's bathroom. And because of this could not replace the battery in the patient's ventilator, as a result of which the patient died. The nurse had worked all her life in the HUS hospital district, where even Jimmy Cartoonin was murdered, medicinally like a stray dog. In front of these facts, it is really hard for me to believe that this is really an accident. In addition, the Finnish courts sentenced nurse of this case to a mental hospital without fault, and based on the Jarkko Kalevi-Leppänen case, this nurse is certainly already on the free side of our society, maybe even as an entrepreneur causing intentional deaths among patients in nursing home care who are completely without any kind of supervision in Finland. I have contacted the Finnish courts to ask them to issue the court decisions in this case, just as they did in the case of Jarkko Kalevi-Leppänen. But since the Finnish authorities are currently aware of my actions in Finland, when I investigate official crimes, which these hospital murders definitely belong to, the Helsinki District Court has denied me this court decision, and this only to prove that it is not wanted to be given, because with it I would be able to track down this nurse who forgot to change the battery in the patient's breathing machine, as a result of which he died, and who must have been released from the prison mental hospital just like Jarkko Kalevi-Leppänen. In Finland, there is practically no control in any direction when even the former ministers of the coalition go to Uganda, not on summer vacation, but to kill parliamentary candidates on the blacklist of the White King of the Coalition and little bit Waco Sooliniinisto. These unclear death cases and declarations of no charges have become a completely arbitrary way for the Finnish courts, which can free the accused from their sentences, as happened with Jarkko Kalevi Leppänen, when the cases go through the mental hospital. But for some, this way represents the subjugation of medicine as a human rat to fuel the academic careers of researchers at the University of Turku. These patients have medically non-existent and imaginary diseases, in the name of which Jarmo Hyatala and Walter Major Helena are allowed to research whatever they want on the medical side with these human rats of medicine, and whose message about their treatment can be refuted based on the symptoms characteristic of imaginary diseases, which in these cases means imaginary delusions. Back to Grace Walden. During her stay at John Gaston, Walden complained that she continued to hear voices, and on the 29th of July, she attempted to hang herself with strips of bedding. Now everyone understands, based on the Finnish cases I have presented, why Grace Walden was taken to a mental hospital and an attempt was made to commit suicide, which is so effectively used in Finnish medical care that it succeeds so well in them, that it has made me interested in Finnish psychiatric clinics, whose patients commit suicide almost one after the other, and those who survive are simply killed. Also, these voices that Grace Walden heard in the mental hospital are just a hoax developed by psychiatry itself, which can be used to invalidate the patient's word, if they had even seen Martin Luther King Jr., the real murderer, and do not want to falsely identify James Earl Ray as the murderer because he is not, according to the criminal investigations of mine. An allegation that Walden was given mind-crippling drugs after her admission to the John Gaston psychiatric ward, and that this treatment led to a deterioration of her condition and her commitment to Western State Mental Hospital in Bolivar, Tennessee, was found to be unsubstantiated. All treatment, including drug therapy, was found to be within the range of generally accepted medical practice at that time. After Walden's suicide attempt on the 29th of July, doctors at John Gaston Hospital decided that due to her continued depression and suicidal tendencies, she should be transferred to Western State Mental Hospital for further treatment. A petition for commitment was filed with the Shelby County Probate Court on the 29th of July, 1968, by John A. Henderson, administrator of John Gaston Hospital. Dr. David Moore, supervising psychiatrist at John Gaston, and Dr. Sidney Vick certified that Walden's psychological condition indicated that she was a proper subject for treatment and care in a psychiatric hospital. Dr. Vick normally handled an average of 15 such commitments in a month, and he stated to the committee that the judicial commitment of Grace E. Walden was handled no differently than hundreds of other judicial commitments handled by me over my 13-year tenure. Walden to State Mental Hospital. 3 weeks later, the allegation continues, she was taken by armed guards to Western State Mental Hospital in Bolivar, Tennessee, and committed. Dr. James H. Druff, Dr. Jack C. Neal and Dr. Morris Cohen, who served successively as superintendents of Western State during Walden's commitment, testified before the committee that once committed, Walden received the appropriate treatment for somebody suffering from her condition, chronic organic brain syndrome, secondary to alcoholism. The symptomology of that disease includes impairment of memory, orientation, and judgment, a shallowness of affect, and an impairment of all intellectual functions. I would like to say here the findings of my own research results. These problems in brain functions such as memory and orientation listed by the previous doctors are not caused by alcohol or alcoholism, but by the extremely toxic drugs that were fed to Grace Walden in mental hospitals and whose side effects are deliberately recorded as symptoms of the patient's medically non-existent and imaginary illness. Imaginary diseases with the help of researchers at the University of Turku to justify their own illegal medical research on unprofitable problem citizens who have been sentenced to state mental hospitals based on their actions, which they have been deliberately provoked into because of the high financial value of this human rat business of medicine. Elevated serum chemokine CCL22 levels in first episode psychosis, associations with symptoms. Peripheral immune state and in vivo brain glial cell function research. This team of Walter Major Helena speculates on the mechanisms of emergence of medically non-existent and imaginary diseases, refutes previous guesses. Of course, one is left to wonder what they are doing in these studies. Well, I have an answer to this too, just like the one regarding Dr. King's murderer. Walter Major Helena's team studies the reaction of the brains of these human rats to various toxic chemical compounds with the help of these human rats at the cellular level with the help of cutting-edge medical technology, guesses the mechanisms of occurrence of medically non-existent and imaginary diseases, and refutes previous guesses. In other words, these medically non-existent and imaginary diseases make it possible to subjugate these problematic citizens into human rats of medicine, with the help of which the researchers of the University of Turku get to study whatever they want with medicine in the name of these imaginary diseases, in the name of which these toxic chemicals are also fed to them as medicine. The doctors agreed that her drug therapy, occupational therapy, and other treatment were well within the acceptable practice of medical and psychiatric standards then prevailing. In fact, her drug dosage levels were on the moderate to low side. None of the drugs that she received were mind-crippling or dangerous to her case. They also agreed that she was incapable of caring for herself and should not have been released or discharged from the institution until appropriate outside support facilities were available. In 1978, when such facilities were available, Walden was released. Please note here that Grace Walden Stevens was not released until the committee's investigation, which also included Grace Walden's statements from the day Dr. King was assassinated, so that her statements can be rebutted by the committee because she has been in a psychiatric hospital for 10 years and hears voices that are psychiatric, its own scam in itself. The testimony revealed that all judgments about Walden's treatment and suitability for discharge were made on purely medical basis, and none of the superintendents was subjected to any pressure from any federal, state, county or municipal authorities concerning the commitment, treatment, or retention of Grace Walden. On the recommendation of the National Institute on Mental Health, the committee retained a psychiatric expert, Dr. Roger Peel, to review and evaluate the records from John Gaston Hospital and Western State Mental Hospital to determine whether Walden's hospitalization, insofar as it was reflected in the records, met acceptable professional standards of reasonable care and treatment. Dr. Peel reported, "The treatment and medication afforded Walden were, in general, consistent with her diagnosis and fell well within the acceptable standard of psychiatric care. In addition, according to an examination of her records, Walden's medical history was consistent with her subsequent diagnosis." At this point, I would like to say my own opinion on these statements by Dr. Peel and other stupid doctors, which you can clean your ass because they are completely lack of medical basis, because these diseases that psychiatry imposes on their patients are medically non-existent and imaginary diseases, under the guise of which the destruction of the brain chemical connections of these patients is justified with extremely toxic chemical compounds, which causes memory problems like Grace Walden. If Walden has been treated like other patients, I wonder how much the United States has sent its own citizens to mental hospitals, which have been seen more as an obstacle to the actions of the authorities or as enemies of the state. Committee action with Walden. In its 1978 decision, the committee took into account everything that had happened in Walden's history, including being locked up in a state mental hospital for 10 years, where his statements on the day of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination were destroyed by FBI agents, offering Walden $100,000 to sign a statement that James Earl Ray would be the killer. With this drag, the FBI agents and other police officers involved in the assassination of Dr. King who interrogated Grace Walden falsely implicated Grace Walden's motives in favor of financial gain, even though the FBI agents and other police officers here have been the ones playing the false game for their own benefit, with the dirty dealings of a lawyer. Contradiction in witnesses' questioning. The committee heard about the reliability of Walden's statement from a Memphis newspaper reporter, Wayne Chastain, who reportedly was the first person to question Grace Walden after Dr. King's assassination, which was before the police arrived. At that time, Walden described the man she had seen fleeing from the bathroom as short and wiry, with salt and pepper hair, wearing a colored plaid shirt and army jacket. During the committee's questioning, Chastain claimed that he had questioned Grace Walden on the evening of April the 4th and that she had told him she had seen a man come out of the bathroom with a military jacket with a box. The committee's investigation revealed that Chastain's story is improbable, if not an outright fabrication. First, the committee determined that Memphis police were at the rooming house within moments of the shooting and were therefore most likely the first to take statements from any residents of the rooming house, including Walden. Second, the committee found it to be highly improbable that Chastain even spoke to Walden that first evening, as the police had sealed off her portion of the rooming house. Third, there is some question about whether Walden, admittedly bedridden that day, was able to see the bathroom door from her bed. Finally, no mention of Chastain's interview appeared in any Memphis paper immediately after the assassination. The committee's investigation did determine that Grace Walden had been interviewed numerous times, beginning immediately after the assassination, and had given several conflicting stories. If you look at the activities of this committee, it is quite clear that this has been influenced by the state level, who is appointed to this committee, who in connection with the assassination of Dr. King drag all the witnesses' questioning into the dustbin as unreliable when it comes to the eyewitness accounts from the murder scene, who actually saw the murderer, Ed Redditt and not James Earl Ray. The only thing that is in contradiction here is the own action of this committee that does not want to see the facts and truths regarding the assassination of Dr. King because in this case the state's interest, which is protected by this deliberate action, weighs too much. What has been the creation of these conflicting situations on Grace Walden and why she was locked in a mental hospital 10 years and why it took 10 years to establish this committee in total, so that all the facts and truths can be denied and ignored so that the massive cooperation behind the assassination of Dr. King with the state police and the FBI is not revealed. If the case is compared to the Warren Commission that investigated the assassination of John F. Kennedy, it is quite clear that it will not find anything that would indicate an assassination because it may be very possible that more than half of the members of the Warren Commission are people who were planning the assassination of John F. Kennedy in the first place and the reason why Lyndon B. Johnson has chosen them for this commission. Rebuttal of Walden's statements. Taking into consideration these factors concerning Grace Walden, the numerous conflicting descriptions of what she saw or did not see on the 4th of April, 1968. These conflicts in Walden's stories are not the same as James Earl Ray's. These conflicts are intentionally caused conflicts by FBI agents. They have intentionally caused these conflict situations through their own interviews, which shows their bias and complicity in the assassination of Dr. King. These deliberately created conflicts have had one and only purpose: to invalidate Grace Walden's statements because she is the only eyewitness who has seen a gunman running down the hallway of Bessie Brewer's dormitory, which was not James Earl Ray but Memphis Police Detective Ed Redditt. The evidence indicating there was nothing sinister in her commitment to John Gaston or Western State Hospitals. That her commitment was in no way related to her role as a possible witness in the King assassination investigation. This action already shows how this law has actually become an enabler and implementer of the dictatorship of the democratic governance model. In my eyes, Grace Walden was taken to a mental hospital quite clearly against her will, and her medical records even recorded that she is a witness to the murder of Martin Luther King Jr., so how can there be any other reason to take Grace Walden to a mental hospital other than to destroy the credibility of the statements, or worst of all, to get Grace Walden to commit suicide? Although the doctors who examined Grace Walden in the investigation said that the methods of operation did not differ in any way from previous operations, it is in fact the same level as, for example, the staff of Nazi Germany's Auschwitz would say that the actions of an individual Jew did not differ in any way from other Jews. But if you think about the operations of Auschwitz on a larger scale, its operations was even partly legal, because Hitler enacted laws to protect German blood and heritage, by which the extermination of the Jews at Auschwitz was carried out and approved. United States and FBI act with Grace Walden like Nazis did with Jews, using laws that are against any human rights because they don't want to get caught in the assassination of Dr. King. The committee concluded that Grace Walden's testimony would be of little or no value, and her statements to the effect that James Earl Ray was not the assassin of Dr. King were unworthy of belief. In summary, after reviewing the evidence, the committee concluded that Grace Walden's alleged observation of someone other than Ray leaving the rooming house bathroom was not worthy of belief. The committee further concluded that her commitment to John Gaston Hospital and Western State Mental Hospital was based on medical considerations and was not related to her role as a possible witness in the assassination investigation. I'll say this again. Why did Grace Walden's medical records say she was an eyewitness to the King assassination if it had nothing to do with Grace Walden's treatment, which is actually the medical torture methods used in Auschwitz and destroying her brain function with chemical compounds which causes memory problems? And as for putting Grace Walden in a mental hospital for these medical bullshits, the operation of these mental hospitals is based 100% on a lawyer-level scam that uses medicine and which is commonplace even in Finland, of which I previously gave examples. Robert Jensen told the committee that Walden's statements to Memphis agents that Walden did not see anything after the shot that killed Dr. King because he was in bed. Walden had said that he had never been given an opportunity by the FBI or anyone to write an affidavit identifying James Earl Ray as the bathroom shooter. In addition, Jensen explained that Walden was never offered $100,000 or any other sum in exchange for an affidavit. If you look at the case from the point I've reached with this investigation, Robert Jensen's statement, if anything, is a lie and an attempt to have Grace Walden's statements rebutted so that Dr. King's assassin and the man behind the trigger, Ed Redditt, would not be exposed. In my criminal investigations, Grace Walden's statements are far more reliable than any dirty FBI or Memphis henchman like Robert Jensen or Ed Redditt, the latter of whom shot Dr. King. Grace Walden's statements from the 60s are proving to be worth their weight in gold for exposing the lies surrounding the assassination of Dr. King, which FBI agents have cultivated to cover up their own illegal activities. The FBI and other government officials actually exposed their own illegal dealings with Grace Walden in how they dealt with her when Walden refused to give a signed statement that James Earl Ray was the murderer. Final conclusion about the committee. This committee has been 100% bought in with all its members and was only established 10 years after the murders in order to refute Grace Walden's statements. The only eyewitness who saw the real murderer, Ed Redditt, on the corridor of Bessie Brewer's. This operation of the FBI together with the committee is so corrupt that I don't think that Grace Walden should have been sent to any mental hospital for 10 years, unless this committee denied and refuted all the statements when its operation is so dictatorial, biased, and its members seem to believe even to UFOs when it appears on paper. It is quite clear that even the members of the Warren Commission did nothing but bless with their own statements the assassination of John F. Kennedy, which, based on the case of Dr. King, came from Lyndon B. Johnson's club of friends and whose activities were carried out and covered up by the FBI's biggest stalker, J. Edgar Hoover. Next to everyone's gonna miss their ex. This same activity has now also spread to Finland, where the Finnish courts bless the fake kidnappings of the rich brats of Cone Elevators, whose scapegoat, Juha Turunen, has been paid off with Cone Elevator money. Media mogul Antti-Paapa Hurlin, who is certainly not doing this for money, but is part of the White King of the Coalition and a little bit Waco Sauliniinisto's squirrel wheel, whose purpose is to corrupt the Finnish courts to the level of the United States, so that problem citizens who are unprofitable to the state can be sentenced there as medical human rats to fuel the academic careers of Jarmo Hayatala and Walter Major Helena of the University of Turku, which is a billion-dollar business at the state level where these disadvantaged citizens act as medical human rats. Final conclusion of the assassination of MLK Jr. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. showed the brutality of a person towards his own when it comes to hatred and mockery of another person and what they are entitled to do to another under the guise of that, such as assassinating a person. This activity is a relic of the Middle Ages, in which a woman who was stigmatized by society was burned and drowned as a witch, taking advantage of the people's hatred for her own actions, which often turned out to be a neighborhood dispute in the case of witch persecutions, and how witch trials only serve to clear another person for their own interests, unfairly of course. The FBI's action with Dr. King only proves, despite all J. Edgar Hoover's repetitions, this FBI's way of working has been more like communism, where the enemies of the state are killed secretly from the people when the opportunity arises, and how the FBI has put Lyndon B. Johnson death sentences put into practice behind facades, with the help of the massive bureaucracy of explanations, of course, which is also used in Finland to murder problem citizens who are unprofitable to the state in medical care clinics. The FBI, based on its actions, has been a law enforcer during the day and its agents an underworld mafia in the evenings, through which the dirty actions of the decision-makers were taken care of, which cannot stand the light of day due to dictatorial practices and violations of the law. This same US activity can be seen in Nazi Germany, where Hitler guillotined his resistance in front of his own ideology, however on a much larger scale than, for example, in the cases of Lyndon B. Johnson, John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. would not have been successful if his own supporters had not turned against him, which was thanks to the tapes released by the FBI and which I will discuss in the second section of my article. The United States, and for whose elite wars are so important that not even the president's life weighs anything next to them when military equipment has to be used against people, and what can be clearly seen in connection with the 911 plane crashes and how the FBI and CIA allowed these to happen knowingly so that the United States gets the right to go to war in Afghanistan for all the thousands of victims who died in the 911 plane crashes. The 911 plane accidents and conspiracies around it are also William Pepper's handiwork, but so will mine too, and now that I have solved Dr. King's assassination, I start to have skills and a proven ability to solve these crimes that US agencies such as the FBI and CIA machine at the request of the decision makers. Dr. King's brutal murder, which was motivated by the secrets of his private life and which are justification for assassinations for the US authorities, and when such behavior is applied to medicine, everyone understands that the high virus is not an invention of Mother Nature, but a virus developed in US medical laboratories, with the help of which an attempt has been made to eradicate homosexuality from the earth, just like Nazi Hitler tried to exterminate the Jews. But no one had such an effective bureaucracy to protect them than the United States and the FBI. The high virus, which in my studies has not spread so effectively through sexual intercourse, but this virus had to be implanted in homosexuals with needle infections, as Henrietta Reponen together with Paver Koch worked with me at the Nurmijärvi clinic, which falls even harder on the illegal actions of medical care that are carried out in its name and which are not carried out by the Finnish police investigations. Martin Luther King Jr. and John F. Kennedy's good values and deeds towards people have been so great that they still help me after the death of these persons more than 55 years ago, and the light of their shines up even to today upon their good intentions, and which is now the very basis of my criminal investigation when I solve the crimes of the decision makers, which includes ethnic cleansing with high virus, and I will make sure that these biggest lost of humanity, John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. did not die in vain.
Be